Folks, how are you guys doing? I'm sure they were out training. Good day for training. John Coffey up on sleep. Mr. Briggs. He was a ground pounder, he was a man. He jumped up. Yeah, he was a smart guy. He's what? Yeah. What the heck? First year. I'm sure there's a few reports of it. You have some time stop this, John, just in case you get out of hand with your comments tonight.
Sure, it's just for me.
Carrying both the upstairs and downstairs. So I get back and I'm like, well, that's the best. I got the bag.
It's too hot to be here. Yeah.
So we put them in.
Glasses outside before.
Yeah, exactly.
Pull it out. And the one downstairs seems to work.
It's a little warm tonight, huh? Yeah. Hopefully we make it quick. Yeah. Fat chance. Yeah.
What'd you call me, Fat Chance?
Yeah. Fat something. Yeah.
Fat head, there you go. That's better than
All I can say is I brought protection from Boki tonight. Oh.
I thought it was French better.
You said protection.
Yeah. One for the
Do
package.
we have a secret we wish to share?
One package.
You know what I was just thinking?
No.
Wallops.
What's that?
City.
Why can't I see
Oh,
I even had a gal work today.
going on?
What is that thing in the corner
When I
of
turned it on, before it was
Gravelly Lake and Washington? In that space, and like,
She and Swillies were out in Steilacoom.
she grew up there, and that,
Okay, she must be Jay's sister.
there is still probably,
A football player.
there is still relatives in the area.
Yeah, did we say yes?
I don't want to mess up.
Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah, I remember her dad used to come to all the track meets, but yeah, I got a ton of money.
Well, there was a cousin or a nephew that ran at Lakes a couple of years ago. He's done Isaac or something.
Oh, yeah, this was Jay, and he would have been, he would have graduated in 2000. At Bellevue.
I'm good, Mary, how are you?
Oh, he was the best athlete.
Might be your brother.
Yeah, he'd be 36, something like that.
Things not to do.
Did you have a good weekend? I did. Yeah.
All right.
Sure they did.
Call this Lake study session, Lakewood City Council for Monday, May 14th to order. The first item for discussion is an update from West Pierce Fire and Rescue, and we have Assistant Chief Sharp and, Chief Sharp and Assistant Chief Alan Curdy. Kind of mind melted.
There you go. Thank you. Mayor Anderson, Deputy Mayor Whalen, council members. We will have a short presentation to give you this evening, just to talk about some of our major programs, not everything obviously, but a few of our major programs and some of the programs that we're changing and evolving. Let's see, there it goes, okay. So you'll find as part of the material in front of you, we also brought a year-end report. We won't be going over that tonight, but I did bring a hard copy for you. And for those in the audience, our annual report is, the full report is online at westpierce.org. On that note, just a little bit of a review in 2017, some of the accomplishments for the fire department. We ran just under 16,000 calls, with about 73% of that is EMS and rescue-based calls for service. For the size of the department that we are and the population that we have, we're one of the most urbanized fire departments in Pierce County, one of the busiest per capita in Pierce County. So definitely, you probably see our medic units and engines running a lot around the city. Our other programs that are very active in the district too are our education programs. Our prevention division went to 256 elementary schools last year. They visit every classroom and every school throughout the school year with a different educational and safety focus for each grade level. And I'm sorry, I guess I should have introduced Hallie, our Assistant Chief Hallie McCurdy. I know most of you know Hallie, but Hallie's also in charge of our fire prevention division and our plans division. So she's the expert in all things fire prevention, from education to safety and code enforcement. So along those same lines, we also are in the high schools teaching CPR to all the high school students. And another program that we're really proud of is our Community Emergency Response Teams, our CERT program. And that's a program we are able to facilitate that through a grant-funded position from AmeriCorps, and we have an AmeriCorps volunteer that helps us manage the entire program. And as an example, this year we have 4 to 5 classes that we'll be putting on with upwards of 25 students in each class. Those are already full for the entire year. And we have a current wait list of over 100 people that want to participate in our CERT programs. And throughout the fire district, we have about just under 500 members that are part of our CERT team since we've started. This year's kind of a big year for us. We're going to have CERT class 40 this year. So our 40th CERT class will be this year over the last 10 years or so that we've had this program in place. The members are, about half of them are active members, still participate in all the training and come back to assist in community program events, but several of them are just active on a mailing list, so if there was something to happen, they're still able to be a part of that through an email system and a contact system. Last year they participated in over 1,300 volunteer hours in the community. Another program that we have that we came and talked to council about last year, we installed about 700 smoke detectors, or smoke alarms, I'm sorry, in about 200 homes last year. And as we presented to council several months ago, or late last year, we have a grant-funded program for this year that we were just starting up. And it was a targeted program, not for homes specifically, but for high risk. We did some studies and found that high risk, it was in some of our commercial properties in multifamily homes, apartment complexes and such. So we've started that program, and most of the target area was primarily in the Springbrook and Woodbrook area and a few other areas within the Lakewood community, but a lot of the targeted areas were in Springbrook and Woodbrook, where we have a lot of calls, a lot of high risk. So we were able to go in there, and what they're doing is they're bringing them up to the newer code, which is to have not only an alarm in the hallway or the main living area, but also one in each bedroom. So they're placing one in every bedroom, which most of these do not have one in the bedroom to wake them up if they're asleep. It's out in the hall or a lot of times near a kitchen or something. And so if it goes off near the kitchen, they disconnect it, and now they have no alarms working in the apartments. So far, that program has installed about 5,000 smoke detectors in 1,900 units. 8 of those were for hearing impaired, and so it's been a very, very busy time for our folks. They're out putting them up, as many as sometimes they're putting up 300 or more in one evening. Crews will go out and target an entire complex and do that. So about 2,000 to go, and really excited about that program, and we're hopeful to go back and look at the numbers again and see what benefit that has derived for us as far as trying to stop some of those fires in a more incipient stage before they have a chance to grow and cause problems to multiple units. With that, we received a total of about $2 million in grant awards last year. Grant awards are a pretty active program for us, and we're again seeking grant awards where we can. Last year we had awards for new firefighters, the smoke alarm program, and some training as well, and hazardous materials. One of the big programs that we started last year, a new program, is what we've called our Youth Academy. And this was something to try and get local youth more interested or more aware, perhaps, of the fire service and the possibilities of having a career in the fire service. So what we did last year is we partnered up with the Boys and Girls Club for one night a week, a 6-week academy. And the students from the Boys and Girls Club, those wonderful youth right there that you see, would come in and they'd learn all kinds of skills for fire and EMS work, from basic firefighting, rescue work, EMS skills, and all kinds of training for a 6-week. And then they had a graduation ceremony in front of our Board of Fire Commissioners. And what was really impressive was not only what they'd learned in that arena, but also what they were able to learn, their organizational skills, the confidence it built in every one of these young women and men, their leadership and their discipline. They were a well-organized group, and it was amazing to see what they had accomplished in 6 weeks. And whether or not they ever become firefighters, leadership, confidence, those are skills that they carry with them into any career in the future. So we're pretty excited about that. And next year, We'll be doing it again this year with some modifications that we learned from last year. Instead of spreading it over 6 weeks, it's going to be a full weekend with full days, 2 days on a weekend, and bring them through all the training in a couple of days. It was really difficult to try and get all the students every week through the summer for a 6-week period. So pretty excited about that, and we've expanded it to include all of the local area high schools for student 14 year and above are eligible to be a part of this program. Let's see, going on to the next slide. Another area that we focused on last year was our entry-level hiring for firefighters. What we found was over the years, we didn't really try to do this, obviously, but what we had done is along the way, we had created a lot of roadblocks for an entry-level employee. Entry-level, in my mind, would be someone who can come in with little to no skills and be eligible to apply for the job. But what we had done, kind of following industry practices from a lot of other organizations, is we put up a lot of different barriers, many of them surrounding cost and time. Written tests, there was a fee for a written test. It was offered usually at one time, so if you had to work that day, you weren't going to be able to take the test. If you didn't have the funds for to take that test, you know, the $50 or whatever it costs for the fee, you weren't going to be able to take that test. There's also a test for physical ability called the Candidate Physical Ability Test, CPAT, a nationally recognized standard for firefighters, and we were requiring them to have their CPAT before they were eligible to come take the test. So again, more money, more time off. To get the CPAT, they had to travel up to King County to one of the local testing areas up there to get the test. So they had to take time off or have the ability to have the free time to drive up there, had to be accessible, had to pay for it, and it expires after so many months, and so you have to continue to retest and get that certification and keep it maintained. And then the last part was we had started to shift towards a requirement for emergency medical technician certification. It's a very common certification that a lot of people have, but it's not necessarily something that everyone has, and certainly not someone looking for an entry-level position. It's very costly. It's put on through a community college, so they have to have the time and commitment and ability to attend community college on a regular basis, have the funds for that, and then graduate before they would even be eligible to then walk through our door for what we were calling an entry-level exam. So a lot of time, a lot of money, and we decided that at every step we were just really kind of putting challenges on people, and so we looked into the diversity that we were actually getting from that, and we looked at racial, ethnic, and gender diversity to see how that looked. And what was interesting was the testing service that we asked them for their demographics, and they said it was a national testing service. And they said, well, we get about 30%. And I thought, well, that sounds pretty good for, you know, diversity makeup if you're getting 30% minorities. And then we looked at it and realized it's a national number. So we said, can you drill that down to our area? We'd like to know, what do you get here? And we found out they were only getting 3% minorities coming out for the exams in their process. So we decided to scrap that. We formed a committee to look at it, and they came back with a completely reevaluated process. And the goal was really, let's drop all these roadblocks, let's drop these barriers. We still want to hire the best. We want to hire the best of the best, but why are we limiting ourselves and the pool of people that are available for us to look at? Let's try and invite as many people as possible to come take this exam. So our recruitment and retention committee created a new testing process in which we hosted our own written exam. We put it on multiple days at different times of the day. So if you worked on a particular day, you could make it to the test on a different day. So you could schedule it on a day that was convenient for you. They had, I believe, 4 different testing times that were available, days, evenings, weekends. It was held out at PLU, so it was close to the bus line. It was accessible to someone with a vehicle or even someone that didn't have a vehicle and needed transportation through public transportation. We did not eliminate the CPAT. Firefighting is a physical job, it's a demanding job, and we need to know that we have candidates that will be able to accomplish the tasks when they go to Recruit Academy. But what we did, rather than requiring it up front, we make it now a conditional hiring requirement. So after we've offered a job, they go through their medical physical, they go through their psychological exam, and they go through their CPAT, and they have to accomplish all those to be hired. And then the last thing we did was we eliminated the EMT requirement, and we extended our Recruit Academy by 5 weeks, and we now teach our own EMT class in-house to all of our candidates. So all the candidates who come in, whether they have their EMT now or not, we go ahead and train them in that. And so what we were able to do is we had a great turnout. We had about 1,000 people apply for the test, And we were able to get about a 30% minority recruitment out of that. So a lot of minorities were able to be a part of that exam. We had people that we hired, of the 10 people we hired, we had some that had absolutely no firefighting experience. They did not have an EMT. One gentleman had just transitioned out of the military, didn't have the capability to have an EMT because it wouldn't have been time to actually go to school before the test happened. So I was able to transition right out of the military and right into a career with the fire service. So we're very happy with the results of that. We're still working on it though.
So the CPAT's a pass-fail?
It is a pass-fail. They can retake it. There is a methodology for retaking it, and it's designed, it's nationally recognized and been validated to be job-specific tests that simulate and reenact the type of job functions you would have to do. So no 5-mile runs. It's nothing like that.
No push-ups, sit-ups, tomorrow.
No, push-ups and sit-ups are not part of it. But climbing ladders and lifting heavy equipment above your head and lowering things to the ground and physical maneuvering like that. So we're very happy with that, and we're going to continue with that and try to continue to provide as accessible hiring practices as we can for those in our local community and those with or without any firefighting skills.
It seems very, I don't want to say entrepreneurial, but it seems like it's breaking from the norm because you hear so many stories about how difficult it is to get through the testing phase and for qualified young people. I think your son-in-law went through.
Yeah,
Yes.
barriers. It was more about negotiating barriers than being the most qualified.
Yeah, it can be very difficult, and for a lot of people, they usually get into the fire service because they know someone in the fire service, and so they can explain a lot of these barriers and explain to them how to navigate a very complicated process. And what we wanted to do is get away from that and allow someone who wanted to enter into the fire service the ability to walk in. We held orientation sessions at our stations to go through that process of explaining what to expect, how the testing worked, what would happen, what it would be like once they got hired, and what the expectations would be. So at every step of the process, we tried to make it accessible and understandable to someone, whether they had firefighting experience or not. One of the other things that we've tried to improve upon is our footprint. And in 2016, we have a very large fleet, and we have 0 hybrid vehicles. As of 2016, we got our first hybrid vehicle. We decided it was time to try and look at some different types of vehicles for our fleet. The worst vehicle in our fleet is our large ladder company. It gets about 2 miles to the gallon. It's an incredibly expensive vehicle to run and operate. So we're trying to work towards a better fleet that's more energy efficient. And in 2016, we purchased our first vehicle, that Volt that you see there. It's a plug-in hybrid, so it runs fully electric until it runs out of power, and then it's got a full gas engine and then runs just like a normal hybrid after that. Fully electric vehicles aren't really in the cards for us. We need to be able to operate if the power grid goes down. So this was a perfect opportunity for us to try something where we could generally stay electric 99% of the time, but have the ability to default to fuel if that's what we had to do. I got to be the guinea pig, and I drove this in the first year. We saved about 500 gallons of gas I fueled at one time, and it reduced our operating costs by about 90% over the prior vehicle that I had been driving. So it was a significant reduction, not only in our increased fuel efficiency, but because it's electric, our staff vehicles come in regularly every 6 months, and they get serviced for oil and all that. But oil is not something that you change on this vehicle for 2 years. So it took 3 shop visits out of the cycle of a 2-year cycle for one vehicle. So it reduced also the workload in our shop significantly. So we've expanded that. We've got 2 more this year. We were expanding that program, and we look to find some new vehicles in the future that are a little bit larger. We only have a few places where this works. We really need some larger vehicles to carry equipment for our folks that carry their equipment, and also 4-wheel drive for inclement weather so that we can still be active when it's snowing or icy. And so there are some new vehicles coming on the market, and we're looking at those to try and expand that and continue to work in that direction. So where we are right now, we're continuing to move forward. We're trying to do a lot of planning right now. Coming, with the recession, there really wasn't a lot of planning, future planning, because it was such a difficult time for the fire service and most public agencies. I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here a little bit. We have recently completed our standards of cover, which is a very complex industry measurement for services and demand for services, and kind of a gap analysis of where our weaknesses are and where our deficiencies are. We have that completed. We are almost finalized with our capital assets plan, which is a full study of all of our capital assets and what the long-range financial planning looks like for that. And then we've also got a medical programs operational plan that we're working as the Labor Management Committee on kind of all the changes that are going on in the medical field. Our call volume is rising drastically, and it's rising for real low acuity stuff that's driven by poverty, homelessness, lack of availability of primary care physicians, mental health. So there's a lot of different challenges out there that we didn't have the same volume of those, even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly not. So fire service is evolving, and our medical programs are evolving with that, and we're trying to develop new plans for how to tackle that increasing call volume in that specific target area. We have 2 assistant chiefs and a deputy chief that will be leaving, or both deputy chiefs and 1 assistant chief that will be leaving in early 2019. So we're doing a lot of planning around that as well. And so we're developing our strategic plan with all of these component pieces kind of brought into the matrix, and setting ourselves up for our future planning, as we'll be out next year with our 4-year levy coming to an end. We'll be coming out to the public in 2019 looking to renew that 4-year levy. And we want to be able to present kind of a forward-thinking plan that shows exactly where we are today and where we see ourselves going over the next, what will then be almost 5 years, because we'll be putting it on the ballot about 8 or 9 months early. So with that, that's a real quick summary of where we were last year, some of the programs we were working on, and where we are today. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Questions for Chief Sharp? Ms. Moss?
More comments. I appreciate the fact that you recognize the diversity as a roadblock. Working with the Multicultural Coalition, it's one of the things that I hear a lot about at the fire department is that there's no diversity. And the other thing is that, and I don't know if this is true, this is just what I'm hearing, that everyone is related some way or another that works in the fire department. So that is a roadblock, and I'm sure that you hit on that when you said that you had a larger pool to pull from this time. So it's good.
Yeah, and I would agree with the assessments of what you've heard. I think the fire service has not been as proactive as it could be in trying to promote diversity and trying to make it accessible to a diverse population. And we're definitely working on that. It is true, there are a lot of family members. Again, I equate a lot to the military. You hear of military families, people get into the military. Fire service is very much the same way, and it's not that jobs are handed out any easier to someone who's a family member, but one, they do understand how to kind of navigate the testing process better than someone, just because they have someone they can turn to. But also, family members tend to have the same work ethics, have the same, usually if one person as a family has a real strong, good work ethic, you'll find others in that family as well, and they're drawn to the same service for the same reasons. So yeah, the fire service generally across the country does become a bit of a family service, much like the military.
And I've heard a lot of that, so it seems as if you're addressing it, so that's a great thing. Thank you.
I'm looking here in your magazine. Can you talk a little bit about your response during the Amtrak derailment?
Yeah, I can actually. We were involved in that at many different levels, and as you know, early last year, many of us from the fire department as well as the city of Lakewood were back in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and getting trained on disaster response and multi-jurisdictional disaster response. And very wisely, apparently, we decided to do a train derailment. And so that's actually what we practiced for about a week, was how to respond to train derailments from a multi-agency perspective. And so we did have a train derailment shortly after that in Steilacoom that went very well, and fortunately there were no injuries. The one south of DuPont was much more dramatic, as you know, and much more significant. We initially did not get involved very heavily on the emergency response. What happened with the decision that they made at that time, the southbound lanes were heavily congested. They weren't sure how easily apparatus from the north would be able to access it. So a lot of resources came from Thurston County initially. But we did have a medic unit, and some of our other staff were down there on site. So we had a medic unit that transported a significant number of patients, and we also had some of our staff that were down there involved in some of the operational oversight on site at the event, as well as doing some of the hazmat mitigation at the event. And then we also sent down several members, Holly included, to be members of the Emergency Operations Center and run the emergency management team that was stood up for a couple, 2-3 days?
2 days for the incident management team.
So they had an incident management team that essentially was running the whole breadth of the event for a couple of days, and we had several of our members that are trained to be a part of that type of a team, and so they were down there in that as well. So emergency medical response, hazardous materials response, and some of the operational oversight, and then also the incident management team. So we were involved kind of at all the different levels of that event.
Well, and I just want to comment on some of the things you presented. I really do appreciate the good working relationship that West Pierce has with the city of Lakewood.
As do we.
And I just think some of the things that you touched on, the Youth Academy, which I think is a neat idea to kind of introduce people to something that they wouldn't know much about. And it's always a big deal because we've had problems for years with pretty horrific fires where people have lost their lives. And so getting the grant and really stepping forward on the smoke detector thing, I think is just a really positive thing for this community. I really do appreciate that.
Mr. Whalen. So looking at the training hours by category, Chief, looks like EMS is an ever-growing portion of the annual time allocation.
Yeah.
As a guy who had elderly parents, and toward the end of my father's life, the paramedics came several times, and they were very much appreciated. Do you see a lot of that happening with regard to the adult family homes and the elderly folks that may have calls for service? Because as you know, we're kind of grappling with that issue in Oakbrook.
Yeah, we do. Obviously, you know, when people are in an adult family home, they usually need a fair amount of care, and they're usually quite often at latter stages of their life, which, as you just pointed out, tends to escalate the need for that care. And so we do go to a lot of the care centers, both the small residential style and as well as the larger care facilities. Quite often, it is an increasing part of the business as the community ages. We also have a lot of people in single-family homes, a lot of elderly over the age of 65 that live by themselves nowadays, and so it's very difficult for them to manage their care a lot of times. And so we're seeing a lot more of that driving the need for EMS. So where we struggle sometimes with some of the nursing homes is when they don't have them staffed adequately and they're trying to use the fire department as a default to provide services.
I was going to ask about
we are there absolutely to go treat patients that have a medical need and transport them if they have a medical need. But there are some expectations that they have to meet as far as taking care of the patient and daily needs and things like that. And so there are times when we get called occasionally where we're kind of taking care of things that should be taken care of by the staff in that home. And so our folks in our EMS division do some outreach with them and work with them and try and get that resolved on a case-by-case basis when that comes around. But generally speaking, it is a big part of our business, and EMS continues to grow. But it's that real low acuity stuff, the stuff that's non-emergent, and so our whole focus with our EMS programs is how do we shift and adapt to the need? It's not going to go away.
Right.
So how do we respond to help someone who doesn't really have an emergent condition right now and not sacrifice a resource that could be available for someone that does have an emergent resource at the same time in the district.
It's a great question, how you balance that.
Yeah, it's a real balancing act, but it's something that, it's not just us either. I mean, this is a nationwide issue for the fire service. Nationally, the fire service, over about a 5-year period, saw about a 20% increase in call volume, and it was all related to low acuity medical care. And it's driven by, as I said, many factors.
So speaking of that, put this in context, you talked about the efficiencies with electric vehicles or hybrids. You see any movement toward smaller responsive vehicles for EMS? And I have an example, driven by traffic, in Hong Kong. Very robust fire service. The fire rigs are every bit as large and sophisticated as we have here. Obviously, with their density, they are very concerned about fire. But with their traffic, the initial response by the EMTs is in a small van that can actually make it there quicker and is more economical for the low acuity things where they don't need transport. So is there any movement in the American Fire Service, or is it just inertia?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I'll give you a couple different answers on that. One is absolutely yes, we're looking at some smaller vehicles to handle a lot of that low acuity stuff. And that is one of the recommendations that's in our medical services committee is we've described it, called it a squad, and that's kind of the name we've given it, but some kind of a squad where it's a couple people in, an Explorer or a pickup truck or something of that nature, but rather than the big fire engine rolling down the street. So yes, absolutely, we're looking at models where we can respond, smaller vehicles, more appropriate vehicles, right vehicle, right time, right place kind of concept is what we're looking for. But the other piece of that puzzle also that we're trying to work on is how do we divert the call from ever happening? I mean, that's really the gold standard of keeping the large vehicles small, keeping every vehicle off the road. And so we have a lot of patients that call us repeatedly. They call us very frequently. And quite often, I don't want to preach to the choir because I know you guys have really been on the forefront of dealing with mental health issues, but quite frankly, you know how it goes. They've got some kind of care issue they need, whether it's mental health, substance abuse, homelessness, poverty, whatever it is, they have a need, but it's usually not jail and it's not an emergency room. So we've started a pilot program about 1.5 years ago to work on trying to divert those patients. And so one of the employees in our EMS division works on when our medics see a certain patient multiple times for something that's not medically related, or at least not emergency room related. They'll connect them, they'll go out, they'll do a patient contact, they'll get them connected. We're doing this pilot program along with the Northwest Physicians Network, and so we've got them engaged in it. And what we found is when we are able to intervene, we can almost eliminate their 911 calls completely. Once we get them connected to the right resource, it's very complex. There are hundreds of resources out there, but finding them and navigating them is very challenging for someone who's already got a problem. And it's not something our paramedics are well versed in. You really have to be in that network to understand the network. And so that's where Northwest Physicians Network helps us network and navigate through that. And so that's our goal, and that's one of the programs we're looking to expand. It's just been a pilot program, and so that employee is only able to work on it, a little bit at a time, a couple of patients here and there, but we literally have hundreds of patients that we've designated as people that would meet the criteria of, that type of intervention. It's just a matter of the time and the commitment, and we're looking to try and expand that with a full-time employee that can be dedicated to that, and not a paramedic or an EMT, because it's not medical care, it's someone, nursing community, mental health community, someone with that background and understands how to navigate and get people to the right care. That's really the ultimate goal for us, is not to have to respond to any vehicle at all.
It would be interesting to kind of get a breakdown of that, and how much of the EMS calls for service are elderly care, repeat, versus any other categories. It seems to me that the aging population results in a lot of calls, just from my own family experience.
Yeah, it definitely does, and as you pointed out, same with my father. In the last stage of his life, the fire department was there, locked. It was all appropriate. It's all appropriate. It's exactly what the fire department is there for.
You're talking about people who have 1,500 calls in a year.
But yeah, what we're talking about is people that have a significant number of calls, but it's not it's nothing we can help them with. It's not a medical problem. It's nothing that the emergency room can help them with. And so it gets very challenging. And, you know, we understand that they need help and they need assistance and they need care, but it's not the fire department. We just don't have the resources to help them navigate that. It's a very time-consuming process. Yeah. And, you know, I applaud the council for supporting through the Lakewood Police Department, their co-responder program, because I think it's a model program for that type of work to try and help divert these people from ending up in the wrong place where they're going to get the wrong care.
Yeah.
Mr. Rossiter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Chief, I know a little over a year ago when we went back to Maryland and we went through the 4-day exercise, and one of the things that came out of that was at one point we got to a place of where there's a question of whether to evacuate Western States Hospital, and we sort of got to the point of none of the 40 people that we had brought there had an idea whether there was a plan or how that would work and what the challenges associated with that would be. There been any follow-up planning with DSHS and Western States about their participation in emergency management and having a plan if anything had to go beyond shelter in place?
I know that we are involved in planning with them. I don't know a lot of specifics on any of that, and I don't know if Holly would be able to fill some of that in, because Chris Badger, who's a joint employee with the fire department in the city of Lakewood, is our emergency management person, and she works directly for Holly.
Yeah, and she has been working with, she works with Western State very often on different plans, and so I'm not exactly sure about the specifics of evacuation, but I know that they have emergency plans, and I know that they exercise on them, and they request our help to exercise with them, and we have done that as well. So I know they have plans, but I'm not sure specifically about their evacuation plan, but I can certainly follow up on that for you.
Okay. Then I guess my next question would be, given that there's only one of your stations that is on the east side of the rail line, is that anticipated to be a problem, or has that precipitated any potential mutual aid agreements with fire districts further to the east?
Actually, we don't view it as a concern specifically, or we do have, as you said, mutual aid agreements. There's for fire districts in the city of Tacoma as well, so not just fire districts, but for all fire districts in Pierce County, there's a overarching mutual aid agreement that everyone has agreed to, and so we do have the ability to get resources from cities and fire districts that are adjoining to us, or even further out. There's a plan as well for as the event scales up to bring in resources from further out, or even from other districts and zones within neighboring counties. So we don't view it as a concern or a problem. We think that if there was something that for some reason bifurcated the district, regardless of the reason, whether it was rail lines or it was a major event such as an earthquake, we would still be able to operate fairly seamlessly, because mutual aid is something we use so commonly. And we train together on a regular basis across jurisdictional boundaries, operate under the same, for the most part, all the same operational plans on the fire ground and emergency scenes. So it's pretty seamless for us.
Okay.
Any other questions? Well, thanks for coming and bringing us up to speed.
Great. Thank you for having us. We appreciate it.
And thanks for taking such good care of our community.
Appreciate that, and we will follow up with you on what we find out about the evacuation plan for what the status is of that for Western States. But
it'll be even more interesting when we're 100% forensic. Yeah. They're one of the fires. Can't couple more together and march around. Engineering and pavement standards update. Mrs. Kelly Pons. Excuse me.
I'm just gonna bring myself up a little bit. Good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Council members. I'm joined this evening by Mr. Ott as well as Mr. Busish. We're here to present an update on possible updates, or possible options, I should say, that the city could pursue to help preserve the integrity of paved streets within Lakewood. Research has shown that pavement, particularly newer pavement, is susceptible to accelerated rates of deterioration when roadwork, such as utility cuts, are performed. The city has invested substantial resources in the improvement of the city's transportation infrastructure over the course of the past few years. Currently, the city has an overall pavement condition index, which is also the PCI score, and this is a system commonly used to grade the health of the surface of a roadway of 78, putting it within the 90th percentile among peer jurisdictions. Given the accelerated rates of deterioration attributed to utility cuts and the high importance the city places on improving and maintaining its transportation infrastructure, it is within the city's interest to ensure that unnecessary utility cuts are deterred and that fees for cuts are commensurate with potential damage, long-term damage incurred by said cuts. Currently, the city has a 5-year moratorium for new or improved roadways, so these are reconstructions or overlays. Attachment C provides a copy of the roads currently under this moratorium, and those roads start on page 2 of Attachment C. So this is all the road work performed after 2013 that is a reconstruction or an overlay. Doing some research on moratoriums here in Washington as well as outside of Washington, it appears that a 5-year moratorium is the industry standard. So if you did want to make a cut during this moratorium period, because certainly there are times where utilities do need to cut into pavement that is under moratorium, there would be a pavement restoration fee or a complete overlay, and this is determined based on the size of the cut into the pavement, and this is all explained in Attachment B, specifically on page 25, which has a table that provides the thresholds for the pavement fee or the overlay. The city looked into this and researched a couple of options. As I mentioned, option 1, while atypical, the city could elect to extend this moratorium beyond 5 years. There are rare cases where this does occur, Chicago, Illinois, and Cupertino, California being 2 of them that we were able to find in our research. It is noteworthy, however, that Cupertino has since changed their moratorium and they now are a 5-year moratorium. As a variation of this theme, option 2, the city could retain the 5-year moratorium with the stipulation that a moratorium on a road would extend either indefinitely or for a predetermined period of time. For the purpose of this memo, we used an example of...
We're having trouble here with your page references because we have ours sequentially numbered for the whole package. So,
gotcha. Okay, so it's 10. 10 is the difference. So if you subtract 10 from what I say, and I can subtract it from here on, but we are currently on page 17. So add 10, excuse me, correction, add 10.
Got it. Okay. We're page 17 of our package.
Page 7.
Page 7.
So as I was saying, as a variation of just extending the moratorium, the city could elect to retain the 5-year moratorium with the stipulation that a moratorium on a road would extend indefinitely or for a predefined period of time. For the example in this memo, we use 10 years. So if the roadway maintained a predetermined PCI, so again for this memo we used a PCI score of 90, 88, and 85. If the roadway maintained a score at or above those rates, the moratorium would stay in effect. So if you look at graph 2, which I believe is going to be on page 16 actually graph 2 shows the average PCI in Lakewood by age of project. So these are all of the roadway projects, again, major reconstruction or overlays that occurred within Lakewood in the last 12 years. The blue line is the PCI of those road projects by year. The red line, red dashed line, is the 90 PCI, the green is the 88, and the yellow represents 85 PCI. So looking at graph 2, essentially if a PCI threshold was made to 90, most projects would be below 90 in 5 years, allowing utility companies the ability to make the cuts. So effectively the moratorium would end. If the PCI was 88, Most projects would remain under moratorium extending well beyond 5 years, and per our information, it looks around 9 to 10 years before it would fall under a PCI of 88. If the threshold was a PCI of 85, many projects would remain under moratorium extending well beyond 5 years and even well beyond 10 years. You'll notice that the PCI doesn't really dip below 85 until after year 12 in the graph. So as another variation on this theme, additionally, the city could opt to extend this model to include a prorated pavement restoration fee based on PCI, and the two options are option 2A to all arterials and collectors regardless of age, or option B to all arterials and collections from 5 to 10 years of age. I'd like to turn the body's attention to page, I believe it's going to be 18 now. So the graphs here break down this prorated model. So if you look at table D, this shows the prorated model with no age limitations. So essentially, if a road maintained a PCI above 90 and let's say hypothetically was 15 years old, a utility company that wanted to make a trench cut or perform any other road work within the right-of-way or on the road would pay the pavement restoration fee at 100% of whatever it would have been in year one. This goes down as you get a lower PCI score. In increments, we used a rather large range here because this is just the initial analysis.
Okay, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So I understand the analysis. Anecdotally, I wonder what the experience is with regard to patching, because these are patches effectively after someone's trenched, and it seems to me that the patches are the ones that tend to be potholes a few years later, regardless of the $16 a foot or whatever it might take to do the patch. How long, anecdotally, how long do these patch trenches really last to sustain the PCI where we really want it to be, which is north of 80, right?
And I'm going to defer that question to Weston. That sounds technical question.
Thank you, Shannon. So it's a little bit of a challenge on how long a patch would last. It would be a function of the thickness of the pavement. So for example, if we did a thicker patch on Bridgeport Way, say up near Custer, 75th, north of Custer there.
Because that's newer pavement that's
Newer
thicker?
pavement, 8 inches thick, that's going to have a fair amount of meat to it. One that comes to mind is, say, Hipkins. There was a water patch, but then again, the patch was thin. So then you have this small amount of pavement that's getting worked really hard,
exactly.
versus a thicker, a little bit more mass to it. So I can't give a definitive answer on, kind of a time, but it would depend upon the circumstances.
Got it, okay.
So backing up a minute to pavement 101, I've always looked at these pavement ratings kind of globally, but in the graph here, it's surprising to me that the degradation between year 2 and year 12 is virtually nothing, and then it goes off the cliff, or takes a more steady trajectory down. What's the reason for that?
So that graph 2 is a small sample set. That's part of the reason. Typically, it looks there is a figure in here of a traditional. It's graph 1, page 13 of your packet. That's more of your traditional. You can see it looks somewhat similar. It's just a little bit different in year 1 and 2. But that's a pretty typical curve for pavement degradation. And you can see by year 10, you're roughly about 90, which is very similar to our data.
So I guess to follow on to Mr. Whalen's question, is this graph changed significantly if there are patches at year 5 and 6? Does a downward trajectory then start at an earlier point?
Yeah, so the system counts a patch as, it would be a negative, it would be a deduct. And it's simply because you have a coherent material, now you have 4 cracks in it, and that's really the reason. In addition, it also defers to, as the observation was made by Councilman Whalen, that that patch is not going to last as long as the material around it. So the software builds that into its curve.
And it looks like patches don't look great.
No, and they don't ride well, they're rough, and really the user, the person driving our roads, it's the ride.
Yeah.
If there's a crack or not a crack, they don't notice that, but how smooth is the pavement?
Right.
And you can never get a perfect patch.
Right.
They did a whole day road.
So I'd say lengthen the moratorium.
It's kind of interesting to me though, and that is, the one thing you can count on is no matter how long ago we actually paved the road, people will assume that we had just paved it.
That's 100%
And
correct.
so you guys just did that road, well, there's a 5-year moratorium, so clearly it was longer than 5 years, but they really do have very short memories or very long memories, whatever. So it's interesting to me that nobody else has gone beyond 5 years. Is there some kind of thing with the utilities where they feel that they start pushing back after, if it gets out too far, they feel like it's unfair, or they threaten litigation, or, what's the...
Yeah, there is a bit of a balance between the utilities and the city, and, if they have to pay a higher fee, they're gonna pass it on to their consumers, and that's you and I. So as it shows, 5 years is pretty consistent. However, I believe it was back in January of 17 when we first started looking at this. We were looking primarily at our arterials because we put such a tremendous amount of money into our arterials over the last 10 years here in Lakewood, and they're your really expensive pavements to put money back into. And so that would be another option too. You could also look at, do you want just the principal arterials, or do you want all roads in general? That's another way to cut it, and I know Shannon has some of that in here. So,
do we know that anybody does this graduated method, or whatever you call it?
To my knowledge, I haven't found any other municipalities that do this.
I think it's very creative what Shannon came up with, because it is really performance-based. If your pavement's at a 95, I mean, that's a great pavement. So therefore you cut it, it's gonna degrade it even if it's 10 years old. But if it's 75, and I know those couple of sections, it's a small sample in that one graph, well, 5 years is the appropriate time.
So a lot of the residential streets that haven't been touched for a decade or more, we're gonna let them cut, clearly, if they wanna start, and then they just have to repair whatever they've had before. They don't have to pay more.
Correct, to the standard repair section in our city standards.
Okay. Otherwise, if it was good street, now I guess I'm a little confused as to the difference. So it's a lousy road, we all agree it's a lousy road, they're gonna do the half cover, or the half lane, right? But now you're saying if I wanted to go down the arterial at year 6, what do I have to do? How is that different?
I think, Shannon, and you may want to jump in, there's a range of different options that are presented this evening, and one option would be at year 6, if it was like in table D, at a 92, then you would be treated the same as at year 4. But if you were at, say, a 75, like in the one example in the graph, then you would pay a 30%.
Correct me if I'm wrong, the half street, you're talking about like a giant overlay, and
Yeah.
that would be a cut that had to meet a certain threshold as designated currently in the engineering pavement standards manual, which you can find, I believe, again on page 26. It lists what that size is. So if this was just a utility cut, say, a 16 by 2 or so, it would not meet that threshold to do the full lane overlay. So in this case, if that cut had a PCI on that road of 85, per example, on table D, they would pay 70% of whatever the restoration penalty fee was.
Oh, restoration penalty.
Right, so these are the fees paid for sections where they don't do a full overlay. So for smaller cuts.
Okay, so this isn't like when the gas company a few years ago was redoing number of mains and going up and down streets and.
I believe, and
that was
again,
before you were here, but
yeah.
and the water guys, they do some residential streets too. So they go into the manual because they're taking up the whole, they're going end to end. This is for the, we're gonna cut a sewer intake or whatever is most restricted.
Right, I believe 30 linear feet is the length.
Okay.
And again, that's page 50 of the packet.
How subjective are you? Right. Go ahead.
So other options that we've considered is taking a review of the fee associated with the restoration pavement cuts. To my knowledge, this hasn't really been looked at for a while, so that would be option 3. And then option 4 would require the increased use of trenchless technologies where possible. This is obviously the more expensive option for the utilities, and that's why utilities don't commonly do this. So city personnel recommend that further analysis on option 2, A and B, and respective of these options implement a prorated pavement cut based on the PCI score. Also, further research into option 3, which is just reviewing the initial pavement cuts. If these recommendations are palatable to the council, city personnel will perform further research on option 2 and return to the council at a study session later this summer.
Mr. Master, question?
In looking at the options, I wasn't quite clear, first of all, that we've opted on a lot of the local access roads that our strategy is chip sealing. That chip sealing doesn't seem to get us to any sort of significant level. I mean, what sort of pavement index do we get to with chip sealing? We don't get to 90, we don't get there. We just like get it back to year 5. And so when we talk about local access roads that have been chip sealed, that someone wants to cut either because they're building a new house on a new lot, or that's something that's been platted, or they're a utility, or being able to go and do that. That how is that impacted by either of the scenarios in there where we've just last year invested in getting that road up, but we never intended to get it back up to the 90, whatever it is. And I just didn't sort of see that accounted for, because while pavement index is important in this, the fact that the city invested money in that road this year is, also a significant factor that I didn't, in that particular situation, I don't see in either of the options.
So in that particular option, and I know Weston can probably speak to this a little bit better than I, the PCI would be significantly lower because there is surface damage done to that road. With option 2B, depending on how much damage there was done to that road, there would still be potentially a chance to recover some funds with the restoration pavement fee based on the PCI.
A couple other nuances. A chip seal is a surface treatment. So typically on our local access roads that may be 30 or more years old, the hot mix they put back would be structurally stronger. So currently that's not addressed in the standards manual. And then you had also asked about the software, how it treats the PCI. It does bring that PCI up to I can't quote the number, I'd have to check on that, but it doesn't take it to 100 as far as I understand.
Chip seal.
When you chip seal, because as Shannon mentioned, your distresses are there, really you just paint it over them and you keep the moisture out of your road bed.
Quick question on the fee. Just remind me, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, I'll come back to my other question.
1650, is there a mechanism in the proposed well, we haven't seen a proposed ordinance yet. Would there be a mechanism to increase that over time to accommodate for general price increases? Because $16.50 per foot seems pretty.
Absolutely, that's
cheap.
something we'd want to look at with option 3, and $16.50 hasn't been a set price over time either, which is the average of the past 5 years.
Okay.
So the philosophy behind this topic, in that if you invest in a road, you sort of want it to not be disturbed in a way that's going to increase the likelihood of it degrading faster. So regardless of which option we choose, this is not a topic or a goal or a strategy that is addressed in our comprehensive plan as a city. So whichever we choose, I think we should also frame it around in making a comprehensive plan amendment that establishes a goal that's consistent with what we decide that we want to do as a way to move forward. None of the proposals seem to also then, referring back to the comprehensive plan, our plan is that we wanted to classify all of our streets in one of 4 classifications, up from major arterials down to local access roads and two categories of minor arterials. Is there any reason or rationale to tier some of the standards in your proposals to the type of road? In other words, cutting Steilacoom Boulevard as opposed to cutting 104th Street, seems that there is a greater need to be able to go through and deal with, once we do a lot of work on Steilacoom Boulevard, or we've done on Bridgeport, to not have it done than 104th Street or one of those other streets, and when we get to veterans and things like that. And that further than whatever we decide to do, further emphasizes the need that I haven't been hearing in a lot of the discussions about some of the projects that we have underway, with the exception being of the South Tacoma Way, Steilacoom Boulevard project, of there being significant co-work being done by us and utility companies. Almost never hear about it being done with the Pierce County sewer people. Do hear some of it being coordinated and done with the water district, and not so much with the Puget Sound Energy folks. But is there some way that we can incentivize coordinating with us inside this policy, when you go back and study it a little bit more, that might get us to, some greater alignment of that actually saves the city money in doing the initial project, if we can look ahead to do that. And sometimes we've heard, well, people are on different timelines, and so we mentioned it to each other, but we didn't actually do it, or sometimes we did because it lined up. But if we could incentivize that, the public funds being spent by all those entities could be used more efficiently.
It's absolutely something that can be looked into moving forward.
I'd like to incentivize cutting in some roads that'll never get an overlay. See if somebody will take care of
So I'm going to walk through this because I think I'm figuring this out. So if we were to take table D on page 18, where the PCI score is somewhere between 90 and 100, which you say, really, okay, so we all agree they have to pay a penalty if So at some point after 5 years, they're probably out of the 90 to 100 range, is what you're saying in your documentation. For the most part, some stuff hangs in there, but let's say it drops to an 88 in year 6.
Right.
So now they're in the 70% range under the proposal that you put together here, example. So then we would say you're an 88, I'm Puget Sound Energy, I walk in, I say, I gotta cut across the street, it's Lakewood Drive that we just did let's say it's 5 or 6 years from now. And it's a beautiful street, and we've put all this money into it. So then Public Works will then tell me, great, you have to restore it to the 6 inches or whatever of asphalt that we have there. And you're also gonna pay us a penalty based upon $16.50 a square foot. Is that?
Correct.
And that just goes to the road fund.
Correct.
So ideally, in the public's mind, we're gonna take that money, hold it, and use it for paving or something at some point. I mean, it's not gonna add up to a tremendous amount of money. Maybe it will. Hopefully it won't. But that's the idea. We're trying to incent them to say, hey, you know, before you decide you're just gonna go and start doing patches all over the place or whatever. All right. I think it's a neat idea. I think it's I mean, if you thought it up on your own, very good. Very good work. Ingenious. We'll see how the utilities look. Good job.
Thank you.
Mr. Branstad.
Hey,
Is that working?
so explain to me to what extent there would be exceptions, like if a gas main broke and Puget Sound Energy had to, in an emergency, go in and fix and mitigate something that was safety-based, being able to go and do that. And I don't know that I'm comfortable with, I'm comfortable with them fix the street, but I guess I'm not comfortable with assessing them a penalty for that, because I certainly wouldn't want them to defer that, and the same is kind of true of other utilities, so that there ought to be some sort of situation that doesn't change the requirement to restore the pavement, but that generating a penalty doesn't seem to be appropriate. I don't like the word penalty being applied to a fee or anything anyway, but particularly that's a pretty negative thing that implies some guilt problem on the part of the person that's doing that. You know, the person who a developer who has some lots and has a street and is building and is going to that's going to happen. I just don't know that there ought to be some categories of things to do that. I mean, a penalty because of poor planning, where you have to go in and cut up a street 2 years after we repaved it, I got no problem with that, but not so much so in responding to a legitimate emergency.
That's absolutely something we'll look into. Currently, how it's structured in the pavement and engineering manual is there is a provision that allows for emergency work without a penalty.
Yeah, it just that it didn't seem to be in the proposals.
And that proposal is made by the engineer, right? Because we had that with Lakewood Water a few years back.
Anything further?
What's that? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you much for the update. Look forward to it. I will note that from personal experience, trenchless technology isn't exactly perfect, because I came home when my home was new and the cable company had come across the street under the street and managed to puncture the natural gas line.
We can laugh about it now.
House was entirely open and there were 3 fire trucks there.
I got a funny story to listen to that about trenchless technology.
We now move to a review of a memorandum of understanding with the Rotary Club of Lakewood relative to Steilacoom Park Pavilion. Excuse me, I crossed one out and didn't see. Rental housing safety program update. Excuse me.
We were ready to
Just trying to get there.
These guys want to take a victory lap for the first time in 2 years.
Although I went out there this weekend, it's not really moving fast. Pavilion.
Oh, it's looking good. Crack down on that thing.
It's moving.
Boondoggle.
So, you've got the floor.
Good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, it's members of the council. My privilege to bring you an update kind of as to where the rental housing safety program is now that we've moved into the inspection phase of the program. Some of the things that I hope to cover tonight is going through some of the registration, what that has resulted in, the percentage of properties being registered, going through the lottery process, where we're at to date with inspections, kind of go through what we're seeing in those inspections, some of the things that we're failing consistently, and then going on to the next steps and continuing inspections moving forward. A couple of quick charts for you. The registration by units to date, the one on the left would be properties registered, so there's just over 2,000 units registered, 2,065. This is as of May 1st. And there's 10,000, almost 100 units registered. The numbers at the bottom, that total rental properties, that's the total rental properties that we know of in the rental universe, at least in Lakewood's rental universe, and the total rental units. So it's about 3,700 properties and about almost 14,000 rental units. So,
by the way, that's a big deal. I just wanted to point that out. These number of units registered with the numbers that we have still to go is a significant accomplishment. I just want to point that out.
Which the next slide kind of starts to show you. You can see the registered as a percentage of total. So the rental units were at roughly just in excess of 70% of the total rental units have registered. The rental properties just crossed over the 50% mark. So rental properties, there's clearly, if you've got most of the rental units registered and a substantial number of rental properties outstanding, that kind of shows you that there's a bunch of single families and duplexes and some of those that are yet to step up and register. So we've been working to get those properties kind of into compliance.
What are you doing, Jeff, to do that?
We've been mailing notices to all of the property owners. We're actually on a 4th notice we've sent out on May 1st, and probably within 3 days of mailing that out, we started getting all kinds of phone calls. So every time we mail one of those out, we get hundreds of phone calls, either exempting or registering those units. So
The other part of that too is if you were pulled from the lottery, whether or not you were licensed or registered.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we go through the inspection process, we are compelling people to register prior to the inspection. So it's kind of a twofold approach.
And there's the additional data point. There's still a number of properties that are actually exempted. So we're finding some of those single-family homes. Although we've sent them 3 notices, they've just not gone into the system and exempted their properties.
What percentage of the properties selected in the lottery were not registered?
I didn't have that number. Our system is not perfect in its calculations, but most of the units, well, actually it's probably, I could get that number for you. My guess would be somewhere in the 60%, 40% range. We actually
were not registered?
Sorry, registered would have been the higher number, and 40% is probably in the ballpark of what
so we might expect it. And how many properties would be selected next year?
When we did the original lottery, basically took, I think we had 9,900 or some units out there. We did basically a 20% split, so we're looking at 2,400 properties, 2,500, somewhere to get us over the 5 years to 10.
So maybe a third of those next year will be unregistered. If squeezing down, it'll be less than the 60. Yeah, it's 40, so you might get 500 to 700 additional properties registered through next year's lottery. I mean, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, we're anticipating to get probably in the next go-around, probably as we go through the year. I mean, we're starting to see a little bit of pickup as we send notices, so I'm kind of anticipating that either a lot of those single families are going to be exempted because we've sent them, in this case, will be 5 notices out to these individuals, so they'll either be exempted or they'll register.
Another factor to consider is that the number of rental units in the properties are exchanging hands on a fairly frequent basis. We were counting this previously at 20% would change ownership within a quarter. So there's a real churn going on here as well. And we're trying to take that into account as we go through this.
Especially in this market.
So just more information at this point.
Mr. Benson.
So in 2019, when we get to a point of where a property is now in the 2019 lottery and it's an unregistered property, is this like taxes, where we're going to collect their 2018 fee and their 2019 fee when they do register?
If I can answer that question, when we get into the fall or the winter time of 2018, we are anticipating coming back with some recommendations on how to deal with the intransigent property owners who have not registered. And is it time to bring forward more aggressive enforcement with the actual issuance of penalties and fines? So that is something that we are trying to avoid, and it's based upon how many people we can get to voluntarily comply and get them into the system. But that's an issue that is not fully resolved, and we're trying to think of creative ways of trying to get people in without fining them.
When you also have the issue where properties have changed hands, so we'd have to look at single family, how long they've owned it versus if it recently changed, or multifamily, so there's some
changing hands aside. It would seem that asking the council for a policy decision about how to handle that you would then be able to include in your urgings of people to register this year earlier rather than waiting until Thanksgiving before you begin to speak about consequences. You know, I think that if you have some proposals that we could deal with earlier, you know, then you could, but that will become effective in 2019. You know, communicating them would help you perhaps get some willing compliance rather than waiting that late in the year.
I think we've done a little bit of that in some of our notifications already, but we can do more of it. I would also say that, you know, my direction from the city, the direction I received from the city manager as well as the council is go easy the first year and see how this works, because this is a new program for many property owners as well as the city staff, and we're trying to be cooperative and make it work as much as possible.
Yeah, I agree with going easy the first year, but I also believe in being transparent about what it'll be after the first year, you know, getting that somewhat decided. In other words, you know, the fact that someone waits until August to register their property this year, yeah, I'm okay with going easy with that. But on the other hand, I'd like them to know what'll happen if they don't. So I'd be interested in getting options earlier rather than later.
Yeah, and along with the program, I mean, as you're aware, when you voted to put the program together, the ordinance has some provisions for fees and penalties for not registering. So they're fairly substantial. I believe they were, what, 150 a day and 500 a day thereafter. So I mean, there's some substantial penalties that we could use as a program to enforce and get people to do that. So
I think on the next layer of noticing, we can remind people the importance to register now versus what could happen in upcoming years and what the fines and penalties could be. That may sway a few people. I'm not opposed to doing something like that, Mr. Branster. It's a good idea.
So the next one is the lottery as we conducted it. So we did conduct the lottery on March 21st, 2018. Dave was actually the initiator of that. When he came down to our office and pushed the little red button and nothing blew up or anything. It was great. So we had our lottery selected, and again, we picked 20% of the registered and unregistered properties, and it's based on Lakewood's historical mix, 82% multifamily, 18% single family. From that, 913 total properties were selected, 2,451 units were selected, kind of a fairly even mix of 450 single-family properties and 463 multifamily properties. The majority of those units selected, as you can see in the table, were multifamily units. Kind of where we are when we conducted the lottery March 21st. We did mail out notices on March 23rd and on March 26th, so single families were notified first. Multifamilies were notified a few days thereafter. The computer system that we use also sends out email notifications to those individuals that were a part of the lottery. We noticed there was some problems with, well, when you register, there's property owners who register and there's property managers who register. So some of the notifications would have gone to property managers versus owners. So we wanted to make sure and make sure that everybody got notified. So we did an actual mail notification to all of those selected.
In addition to the email system that we use.
So then we started our first inspections on April 16th. We've been doing those for about a month now. And on May 1st, we sent out the fourth registration reminder letter. There was about 1,200 properties that we sent that out to, and the phones have been going crazy ever since. This kind of shows you what the mix of the properties that we've inspected. And these have changed a little bit to date. So as of this inspection, it talked about 23 properties that had been inspected. 48% were single family, 30% were duplexes, and 22% were multifamily. Kind of where we are now since this, we have added a total of 38 properties have been inspected. Single family is about, it's fairly simple or fairly consistent mix. It's about 52%, 53% of the properties inspected have been single family. Duplexes is about 26%, and then multifamily to date is about 21%. So the numbers that we're inspecting they're higher, but they're fairly consistent with the percentages of inspections.
This is based upon first come, first serve. So you call in, you get on our schedule, and then we go and make the inspection. So this is kind of telling me that the single-family landlords and property management people are the first ones who have registered for the most part. And over time, you'll see the reduction of single-family and more of the multifamily.
Yeah, and that's
what's been the response? Are they somewhat welcoming? I mean, if they're calling the schedule, they obviously want to get it over with, right?
Yeah, we've been pretty pleased. I mean, a majority of them have been very happy to have their units inspected. I mean, most of the ones that we've gone out to in the onset were individuals who were very proactive. They registered early. They were ready to go. Some of the ones that we've inspected early were some of the non-registered properties, so we've done a few of those as well. We make them get their business license before we inspect their unit, but they were, I don't know if it's pleasantly surprised, but they seemed okay with the inspections and didn't mind the intrusion and realized when we were out there it wasn't really that difficult of a checklist to actually comply with. So
someone's waving their Fourth Amendment flag with their AC.
No, we've had some tenants who didn't really like us in their units, but the property managers have been okay so far. So good.
Let's just say that staff's been pleasantly surprised.
Yeah. One individual, yeah, I will never forget. We walked into her house and she looked at both Heather and I. She goes, "I don't like strange people in my apartments." And I looked at Heather and I said, "Well, Heather, that means you. I guess you got to go." So the inspection results kind of to date, and again, this goes back a little bit further, but you can kind of see that we've had a lot of failed inspections. We really didn't have any past inspections until May 1st, so we've had a 100% failure rate until May 1st. And since then, we're at probably a 60% passing rate.
Ms. Moss.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. On the fails, how long do you give them to correct the problem?
It depends on what they fail for. Most of these, I'll show you guys in the slides as we go forward. Most of the failures that we're finding are they're life safety things. So we have a life safety is a 10-day requirement, and anything else in the checklist would be a 60-day fix. There are some things that we would kind of give them a little bit more time for if you have to order windows or you have to order components. I mean, some things you just can't get that fast.
Do you look 6 months to a year, or do you have a set time that you do?
No, we're typically following up with these individuals. The life safety ones, well, basically all of these are going to have life safety issues, so it's smoke detectors and electrical issues and so forth. We're typically following up with them at 1 week, and then we'll follow up with them again at a 2-week interval and kind of see where they're at and make sure that they're moving along. And a lot of them are getting their things fixed and having us re-inspect. We have a few inspections scheduled. We've had, I forget how many, 7, I think, of these have passed since we've started inspecting, so they're starting to schedule re-inspections. We haven't gone back to them all because we've had to kind of put them in the middle of all the other inspections.
Keep in mind, too, these numbers are changing daily.
The reason I asked the question, I attend the school board meeting, and the report that they're getting is that we've given them up to a year to correct any of the issues that they have.
Yeah, we haven't told anybody a year. We want them to do it as quickly as they can for smoke detectors and GFIs and electrical issues, and those are things that they can change out. And we've told them you can change that out in realistically 2 days. There's no reason why you can't change that out.
But Ms. Maza, if we went into an apartment complex with some really serious violations, it's going to take a while to fix things. As long as the property owner or landlord is willing to work with us, we'll put them on a schedule to get the work accomplished. Because one of the things that we're careful about too is, getting into tenant relocation, because that costs everybody money. So if we can move around people from apartment complexes that are deemed safe, while the other ones are getting repaired, if there's vacancies, we'll work with the tenant landlords on those kinds of things. But in some of these apartment complexes, I do suspect it will take several months to fix things.
But you haven't given anybody that information?
No.
I mean, a good example is we did the same thing with the B&I.
Right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, you can kind of see the property. So even at this juncture, I'll kind of tell you where we are now. But obviously, we've conducted more inspections than this. So we're at about 240 units represented of the units inspected, I should say. We've inspected. Oh, where am I doing before I start counting? We have inspected 38 properties. 94 units on those properties were inspected, and of the properties that we inspected, total units equal to 252 units on those 38 properties. So we've kind of got a small data set that we're working with right now. We have scheduled on the list about, I think we have a total of 38 more inspections that have been scheduled to date, not including re-inspections. And about 1,100 total units will be represented at those inspections. So we're starting to kind of get some of the bigger properties in there. One of the biggest we inspect on June 19th is Morning Tree. It's 403 units apartment complex. So we're starting to get some of the larger complexes coming in.
Fortunately, on that one, we can only inspect up to 50 units. So roughly, it's about 20%. So when we say that we're inspecting, we're not inspecting the entire complex because the way in which the law has been written doesn't allow us to do that.
It's a percentage.
It's a percentage, but it seems to be working fairly well so far.
So what happens when, I'm encouraged by this, we run at least one fatality a year in a rental fire. And if nobody has, the common denominator here seems to be people don't have smoke detectors.
Yep.
So if we can save half of those people, I mean, the whole program's worth it. If we save one, the whole program's worth it.
Yeah.
So what happens when we inspect a 50-unit complex and it's obvious that they don't have working smoke detectors in the 20%? Do we require them to re-inspect all units to make sure, or get some sort of compliance?
Yeah, we did. As you look at that chart, you can see the 3 from the bottom, the 104 units. We inspected 21. Every one of those 21 units were missing smoke detectors in many of the rooms. They were missing water heater straps. They were missing GFI circuits, they were missing overflow valves. I mean, it was fairly consistent over all those units. So what we told them when we left is, one, they have to do every unit in the complex. 104 units are clearly going to be, if we inspected them, exactly like these 21 units were, because it was the same thing.
And the code, and state law allows us to do that, because if a significant number have failed, you can go in and
reinspect all of the units. So that, and that's what we've been telling them. It's like, you have two options. One, you can either fix them all, or two, we can come back in and inspect all of the units, and clearly they're probably all going to be like they were. So we're able to get them to bring those into compliance, and then we'll go back in and inspect a percentage of the 21 units, as well as some, I've been telling them we're going to look at some random units. We'll give them 2-day notification so they can get their tenants notified, but we'll also be looking at the others. And I've been making, in this instance, we're having them do either photographs in each and every unit, so I can see they put fire or smoke alarms and they put the straps and stuff on the units, so physically take pictures as they go into the units, or videos or something, so I can see in all of those units that they've inspected them all.
So, just a quick question on the follow-up then. At this point in the process, it sounds like it's been staffed in inspections as opposed to the third-party inspectors. So on those that have had re-inspection following a failure, what's been our kinder, gentler approach to the re-inspection fees?
We've had, like the first property, the triplex, we went back in and I believe we charged him actually, yeah, a 1-unit inspection fee. We've been kind of breaking them down, and rather than charging them, if they had like the unit at the bottom, they had 21 of those that failed. We're going to do, I believe, 10 of those units when we go back and inspect, and 3 of them will be at random and 7 will be those same. So rather than hit them for complete failure inspection rate of all of them, we've been trying to work with them. If it's a duplex, we'll be happy to go look at both of them and charge them 1 fee. It's the same property, so it shouldn't be very difficult. 125. So we've been working with them to try and work on some of those. If it's things that we have to look at, I mean, if there's some, I'll show you some pictures later. I mean, there's some clear electrical violations that I'm not willing to let somebody take pictures of. I want to physically go out to those units and make sure they're there. If there's windows that don't meet egress, some of them don't. That's not something you can take a picture of. I need to come out and physically look at that and make sure it's right.
So, to help me out a little bit on the life safety issues, those are things that maybe were never in some of these units because code has changed since they were built, but they're life safety issues, and there's no, what do we call it? Grandfathering in, or are they cases where they just went in and maybe did a major redo, and they never did strap the water heater, they never did put in the GFI plug because when they fixed it up, I mean, is it just, what do you think?
Kind of some of both. I mean, some of the life safety, the codes have since changed, like some of the smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors. I mean, that's all been updated, so that's been changed since most of these buildings were built, but it's not very costly for them to do that. So I mean, you have to put a battery-powered smoke detector. It's $8 to $12 to do that. You do that in 3 bedrooms and a hallway. It's less than $50 to do, so it's not a huge cost. Things that we would consider, I'm just going to go through the checklist real quick. I mean, like things like vermin or rodent infestation. I have not, no. We're going to. Things like, obviously, egress, so bedroom windows that don't meet egress or that have been changed that are made too small. Things like, obviously, doors, egress, stairs and railings,
now,
handrails.
Egress issues are something you're going to go out and inspect.
Yes. Yeah, that's not something you can take a picture of. That's a big life safety thing. 1, for firemen to be able to get into a unit, and 2, for somebody to be able to get out of the unit. So those are.
So, just to be clear, but two life safety issues where units were compliant when they were built or last major remodel and aren't now. Common ones would be the bedroom windows too small.
Correct.
And they don't have GFI because they're never wired for GFI.
GFI is straps on water heaters and smoke detectors.
But you go into a unit that's 60 years old, that's in good shape, but it doesn't have a GFI. That's one question that's come up from constituents is, I have to rewire my whole place, because you can't, it isn't as simple as just swapping it out.
Actually, it is. I mean, it can have some ramifications on your electrical system, but a GFI is basically a breaker at that point. So if there's anything downstream of that, it will affect those circuits downstream as well. So if there's plugs after that, it'll shut them off as well. But it's not something that is very costly. You can actually just switch one of those out and plug it into that circuit. It will shut off that circuit.
There's two different kinds. One looks like it's really GFI, and one's really grounded, operates fully.
But either of them will work. If you put a GFI on a grounded circuit, it will work the way it's supposed to. I mean, it's supposed to send it into it basically detects a ground fault. If it's not grounded, it doesn't have a ground, but it still can detect a ground fault. There isn't anything that it can ground into, but it will still shut that circuit off. So it works the same way, it just not quite the same way.
Yeah, around the GFI question, which seems to be a significant item to do that. That's a health safety
Yes, we have identified it as
issue. Does fixing that something that requires a permit from LNI
For GFI?
to rewire circuits and?
Technically, you're changing a circuit, so yes, you are supposed to have one. I can't tell you if they're getting them because I haven't gone out and looked at any yet. So.
Say that again.
I said it is anytime you modify an electrical circuit, you're supposed to get an electrical permit. I haven't gone out to re-inspect for any of those yet, so I don't know if they are not.
Licensed electrician.
Or a homeowner could do it, yeah, if you own the property.
I do.
But you have to you're supposed to get the permit.
Yes.
And, but we're not asking for it.
I haven't gone out to look yet, so.
You aren't considered a homeowner if it's a rental.
Correct.
You know, I guess that I would be cautious if we're identifying a deficiency, then we're re-inspecting and saying the deficiency has been corrected, and it's unpermitted work that should have had a permit. You know, I think that when you have that sort of a deficiency around electrical things or anything of that matter, where you know you should inform a person that fixing this requires you to get a permit to be able to go and do that. And certainly, it should be an element of our reinspection to see if the work that was been done was appropriately permitted and thus done by a competent person or inspected. My other question is, what kind of reception have your inspectors gotten from tenants? That was one of the things as we were always going to put this in about how the tenants were going to be up in arms.
We've only had one that I mentioned earlier that was not happy to have us there, but a lot of the other tenants have been, I mean, they seem amenable to having us there. They haven't said anything ill in our direction. I mean, we've actually had a few tenants. What we've found is most of the tenants are just kind of there and they don't say anything until the property manager or somebody goes away, and then they'll come over and say, hey, my electrical circuit for my heaters hasn't worked for 2 years, and then they'll go away. And so, I mean, they're telling us stuff when nobody's around, so it seems like they like us there. I haven't really heard a lot of comments, positive or negative, from
There
them.
was one instance where we were there at the door, he opened it up, he went back to bed with his significant other, stayed in bed, and the kids were playing, the inspection was performed, so it was very nonchalant, so it varies from unit to unit, but we haven't seen the adverse negative reaction that some people have been talking about.
That was
It's a little awkward, when you have to go in and inspect a bedroom and there's people still asleep in the bed, and it's like, we're coming in to inspect. Wow.
Go there. Yeah, comment on that. Okay. On that note, anything further? More slides?
couple of quick things to kind of show you what we're seeing, and you kind of hit the nail on the head. Some of the things that we're seeing failed, obviously, are smoke detectors, water heaters, and GFIs and other electrical sort of issues. And there's some structural components that we've found some issues on some of these places.
Huh. Where was that?
This, why does the pointer not work? There it is. Oh, you can't really see the pointer. But obviously the picture on top is how a water heater should be installed. You typically have straps on them. We don't find those though. The overflow valve is missing in many of these. That apartment complex is the one we just talked about this morning. The name escapes me, Dave.
I don't remember.
I can't remember either. It's they had a bunch of work done on this, or at least improperly done work on this apartment complex. But the decks, when the building inspector went out, we had to get him to go out there and look at this.
One gentleman was complaining about a public comment some time ago.
There was some water leaking into one of the basement units. Merrill Garden, there we go, Merrill Creek.
So that's what it is.
Yeah. And so this unit has significant rot on the back of the house. The decks, you can't really see in this picture very well because I had to make it kind of small, but you can see there's 4x4 posts that have been added onto this thing. All of those beams have kind of rotted out. So they decided to put 4x4 posts, which I guess is better than nothing, from the first floor to the third floor, but all of that's bearing on a 3-inch piece of concrete on the slab. So it's really
built on a slab.
Yeah, it's bearing on nothing. So and the amazing thing is there's a guy on the third floor deck standing out there watching us take pictures. I wouldn't be anywhere near
Merrill
that deck.
Creek was permitted by Pierce County before incorporation. We were just incorporated when that project was under construction. It was completing at the time. There's some problems with the way in which the property drains on site that they need to fix. And there's a significant cost factor, and the landlord's going to have to fix it. So we're finding things out, all kinds of.
This was missing when I redid this, and there was another slide missing.
Oh, was it at Holly Holmes building? I think it was on Merrill.
That's not the correct.
Daughter of.
Yeah, this isn't, unfortunately, it's not the exact slide or the presentation I have.
We have this.
There you go, you have it. So in the next slide, you can see, I mean, that's one of the apartment complexes that we went to, and you can kind of, unfortunately, I don't have it on up here, but you have it on yours. You can kind of see the three pictures. One of them has an awning that's completely failing and falling down on an apartment complex. And the other two pictures, there's some very creative wiring that I have seen in the apartment complex. They used molded extension cords all over throughout the complex. They wired them into fixtures, they wired them out of fixtures, they wired them everywhere. It's just
78.
Yeah, page 78. It's not even close to safe.
So what do you do in that case?
That one, that's one of the ones where all of the units, basically, we're gonna have them go in and do a bunch of stuff in the units, and we're going back and inspecting, I believe, all of the units that failed, as well as a couple of other units. So that one had significant issues.
Those are major
That's
electrical
one
permits.
apartment complex.
These three?
Those three are from one complex, and those are not even kind of all the really bad stuff. Those are there's actually worse stuff there. That was just something that would present easily.
And that's a case where they're gonna have to get a permit.
Oh, yeah.
They're gonna pull a permit because it's major work.
Yeah,
They're gonna have to get the right electrical people, and we're gonna inspect the work.
This is gonna require building permit, this is gonna require electrical permit, this is, all kinds of permits.
And how many days do they have?
The smoke detectors, they said they could get done in a week, which I'm fine with. The electrical, they're gonna have to get an electrician out there, and we're working with them on the schedule to get it done. I think they have 22 units, so it's not something they're gonna get corrected very quickly.
Going to the mayor's comments previously, this is a life safety issue. This is potentially saving some.
Where's this one located, Dave?
I don't remember.
Klein, this is either Klein or Kendrick.
Okay.
So you're in
106th
Central
block in
Lakewood.
Klein.
This one looks like it would be ready for an abatement
When I
process.
walked out on the back of this property, I told the property manager, I said, you have two options with this. One, I'll do the dangerous building program and I can tear this down for you, like next week. Yeah, or you can tear this down for yourself next week, because this is clearly dangerous and this should not be there. And she was in full agreement, but the property owner has not wanted her to tear it down, so.
The exterior, out of state property owner?
Yeah.
This is also someone who did not get a license that we compelled them to prior to making the
Well, here's example number one why this program makes sense.
Yeah, the property manager wants to comply. She's been trying to get the owner to do things, and every time we would say stuff, she showed us letters that she sent to the property owner. So there's issues where, yeah, it's
So
not
this doesn't,
necessarily.
that thing doesn't even, that awning thing doesn't need any permit.
No, it's completely overframed. It's literally collapsing. There's a shed behind it that's got all kinds of electrical issues. It's collapsing, and it's literally on the back of somebody's porch. So you go out of the back of the unit, and that's what they stand under when they go out their back door.
But for only inspecting for a month, I mean, I think, and we're making pretty substantial progress. The other thing I would point out too is that we were contacted by the city of Tacoma today.
So are you compiling a kind of a parade of horrors here?
Not yet, but we
Well,
will.
photos,
As you
yeah.
as you find those things, date them and
Yeah,
document them. And
Great anecdotal
keep them
evidence.
in an electronic scrapbook so that we can use it as.
yeah. I have an inspection photo file that I've been keeping, so of properties by year.
But it also keep the right side pages of that scrapbook.
Oh, yeah.
With good news stories.
Sure.
I do, first of all, I think this is a great start. I think this is doing exactly what we wanted it to do, because you haven't run into it, although I think that one is a pretty horrible case, but we're not having to red tag the whole building. But clearly, this is the kind of stuff that I think we were hoping all along, that let's do these life safety issues, let's fix these things up. So on the flip side, and just to make your life more complicated, somehow track how much work is actually occurring because of this dollar-wise. Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, when you come in for electrical permits, we can't check, we can't.
Okay.
But for building permit activity, yes. And if it's part of an abatement, we can have a tickler on our system to track that and see.
Or it'll just show up in the general numbers that we have more.
You're gonna see more remodels.
Permits, yeah.
Rehabbing.
That'll probably be good enough.
Yeah.
And you've seen an uptick in that in this past year anyway, so, we were talking that, you'd see a change in 3 to 5 years. I think you might see a change faster than that. And you could fairly see a major change in the quality of life in housing units in Lakewood fairly quickly if we stay on top of this.
In your inspection, on the back, I'm looking at the back of this building here. There's a lot of mold and moss and stuff on that. Is that part of the inspection that would be
When
cleaned
the
up?
mold and moss is present, that means that there's a lack of ventilation, proper ventilation.
Or water intrusion.
Or water intrusion. And sometimes, in order to keep the costs down as far as utilities, the renters will close off the heat or whatever to that unit. And so when you start doing that, then that's when you have a propensity to create the moss and the like. Or if you don't have something that was properly built for drainage, then we're seeing it the other way. And in another subject, we will get a lot of balconies and stairwells and the thing that will need replacement. That's a guaranteed. Landlords will take them out because they're rotted, and they go back and install something that's kind of sort of temporary. And there are specific requirements for stairwells that have to be maintained.
Yeah, it's a life safety.
It's a life safety issue. Keep people from falling off the second floor.
Well, we have the peeling.
Yeah, that's another example. But
But
you'll see more of that as we get into the apartment complex. And
Yeah.
going back to the Tacoma thing, they're interested in what we're doing, and they've asked for copies of our procedures and forms.
Oh.
The Tacoma thing, what do you mean?
We were contacted today by them. They've heard about our rental housing safety program, and they're asking all kinds of questions.
They collect money for theirs, but I'm not
Yeah,
sure
they
what
do, a lot.
Yeah.
And we don't. I mean,
Right.
be honest with the council here, the cost recovery is important to me. And I track how much money's coming in and making sure that what we're expending is of equal proportion. That's why we didn't hire an outside consultant to help us with inspections. We're doing it internally because the price tag was too high. But, that's a budgetary issue that we'll talk more about as we get into budget. But, my goal, the department's goal, and I'm sure everybody else is the same, is to try to make this an ongoing system where you pay to play and the costs are not exorbitant, and it keeps running the system. My goal too would be to see if we can't run this program with just one person. And Pasco is able to do that, and with the level of automation that we've already are using, I'm hoping that we will continue to do that. So that's the goal. Whether or not we make it or not is a different question. And we're also still in an experimental stage here, so keep that in mind.
I think this is a really good start.
One thing I think we're gonna see too, right now, we're kind of inspecting, I won't say the cream of the crop, but we're inspecting houses that people, when we go out there, they're expecting to pass. So we're not looking at properties that have a lot of issues. As we go through this into the end of the year, we're gonna start seeing some of those other properties that are not being maintained. So I think where you're seeing some of the issues on some of the really easy life safety things, you're gonna see an increase in some of the real big issues that we're gonna start seeing.
Have you as a I'm sorry, I'm just interrupting, but have you as a contingency developed a plan for when we have to red tag a property and move some folks? Meaning, if it's like I can't let these people stay here tonight, what, do we have, you've developed some contingencies?
We do.
To move those folks? Okay.
So, yeah, at least what the plan will be is, one, that's not our call to tag it first. So code enforcement and the building department will end up coming out helping us with that. We also do the rental relocation, the 5918-085. So we write a letter that the owner is responsible to reimburse the tenant X amount of dollars based on their rent. So they've got to reimburse them for that. We also have CDBG dollars that we can move them out of there and then get reimbursement from the owner. You can use abatement dollars. You can use all kinds of.
Also, in an emergency, we can take advantage of some of the police department's funds.
Okay.
And try to move people over to the home motel if necessary.
There's some small Nisqually funds.
There's some small Nisqually funds. We have a yellow tag and a red tag procedure. We try to be flexible with this, but ultimately we're trying to scare the property owner in being responsible.
Okay. Good job.
Do you feel you have all the tools in place from a code and regulation standpoint to affect cost recovery if we have to pay for people's relocation?
Yes, we've been very good at doing that. In all the times that we've done rental relocation, we've been reimbursed all of our monies every time.
Legal department's been very good at supporting us in that process.
That's great.
I will also say this, after doing this in relationship to watching other programs that have failed, and it's going to say that I like lawyers, and I maybe not so much, but you know, the whole issue of but when they decided to challenge Pasco's program and go to the state Supreme Court, and they came back with their decision, and then the legislature codified it, that was the best thing for the city of Lakewood and others. It really established some basic ground rules to work from. And as long as you stay within those rules, I think we're fine. And we've definitely tried to do that.
Thanks to the lawyers.
Thanks to the lawyers.
Thanks to the lawyers. There you go.
Hey, boy, that's a nice recovery. I thought you were bucking for another absence.
Administratively.
That could be a forced absence. Yeah. Okay, I know you have other business.
All right, well, thank you very much. That's
Thank you.
encouraging that you're off to such a good start and making progress. So now we move to a review of a memorandum of understanding with the Rotary Club of Lakewood relative to the Steilacoom Park Pavilion.
Hey.
Ms. Dodsworth.
Hey, Mary. Good evening, Council. I'm here tonight to share with you an update on the latest MOU. We're on MOU number 2 regarding the pavilion in the park with the Rotary Club of Lakewood. So this is, a year ago, Council approved an MOU that showed the commitment that we wanted to move forward with this project, and it outlined what we were thinking about and the direction we were going in, some time frames. So this is a more specific MOU that really clearly outlines primarily financial expectations for the Rotary Club, and then what the city would be covering as well, and then responsibilities as we are moving into construction, which we're under construction now. But to make sure that we're really clear that we're going to be doing proper bidding, who was supervising and expectations of Rotary in the city, which is outlined as well. So the MOU's attached, it's fairly clear. And then there will be a final MOU that'll come after construction, so we can finalize those details of legal ownership, potential use of days, any warranties or issues that might be outstanding based on what's happening throughout the time period, so that we can clarify all those things, also talk about liability, et cetera, so that everybody's real clear who's on first as we move forward. And so there would be another, potentially one more final MOU regarding this project after construction's completed and project's been accepted. I did give you a heads up in the report, Rotary's intention. They would like to put in an application or proposal to name the stage. They understand it's the pavilion, that's what we're calling it this week, the pavilion at Fort Steilacoom Park, with the idea of naming the stage the Rotary stage. We do have a naming policy in the city, and so they would follow that procedure, which would be submitting an application and justification for that. According to our policy, it would be submitted to the city manager, who would then forward it to council, and council would decide if you wanted to use a process such as working with the Park and Rec Advisory Board or another group to review it, or just go forward with that. Council would make the final decision regarding the process and also the decision regarding any naming. And then they've also proposed in the final MOU the opportunity to have some Rotary days, similar to how we have city days at McGavick Center, some Rotary days. They have requested 3 days, and council could decide what that impact would be to revenue, use, expenditures, et cetera. We put a value based on the business plan, and then the fee schedule hasn't been updated yet. That'll be coming to council probably after the park board reviews it, which they'll be looking at it for the first time in May. So the MOUs provided, I'm happy to answer any of your questions or talk about the project or where we're at, where we're going, but so far everybody seems to be on the same page, and this was just to formalize those expectations regarding the construction.
What was the name that they wanted to be?
Well, what they've proposed is the Rotary stage at the pavilion in the park. Mm-hmm.
Mr. President.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Douglas. The concept of Rotary Days, and you compared it to our relationship with the McGavick Center. So the Rotary would want to be able to rent it out for 3 days and keep the income?
I think what they had proposed was 3 separate days, could be days in a row, but one would be primarily make a weekday, like a Friday, where they could have an annual meeting at the park, at the pavilion, where they could do maybe a summer party or something. And so and then 2 event days, which would be probably a weekend type event, and that they wouldn't have to pay a permit fee. We would certainly, depending on the event, number of people, impact to the park, there could be things like sanitation or garbage or security or something like that. If there was an alcohol permit or insurance, those things would be in addition, but that's what I would probably recommend for council to consider is that if they were going to accept any of those days, I think their intention is to not have to pay the special use permit fee, which would vary based on, and then they would get whatever revenue is generated. If it was a concert or a special event, or they would generate the revenue from that event.
But not really.
Okay, I guess I'd have to look at it. I guess I would be concerned if they were were contracting the use of the pavilion to a third party. It's different than them holding an event where they're revenuing, but rather than them renting it to the American Red Cross for the Red Cross to hold a fundraiser.
That could almost be considered a gift, I would think. So that could be clearly outlined in whatever the final MOU is that it would be specifically for a Rotary sponsored event, not to be auctioned off or given away.
They thought about renting out to the Lions Club, but they didn't know if they could. Kiwanis, maybe.
Yeah. The council can outline all those conditions in your next MOU, specific to how those days could be used, number of days, And then we'd have a better idea specifically about what the revenue impact would be, what the expenditures are. There's always expenditures associated with everything at the park, so. Priorities, et cetera. Right, and it would be a mutually agreed upon day. I mean, it would be considered, you know, currently we let our nonprofits and community groups that we have regular events out there, we contact them in October-ish and give them about 30 days to make notice of those days they want to continue. We try and be consistent with, you know, if it's always the third Saturday or the fourth Tuesday or something. And then after that, it ends up being kind of a first come, first serve. So they would have to work within those. We wouldn't bump somebody. But that's how we operate.
Anecdotally, I've been told that one of the reasons to do one of the 3 days is to have their annual meeting or a meeting out there, and then they go forth and do their maintenance for the year or whatever to the landscaping and grounds. It's kind of part of their contribution annually. So, I mean, there's some value in having them out there to do their thing after a lunch, and then the guys stay, the gals stay and do their work.
Yeah, the refurbishing the big toy and that kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
that kind of stuff.
Any questions?
I was out there on Thursday. They have a every Thursday construction meeting. So I went out there with James, and Scott was out there, and the contractor and the other Rotary guy. So I think it's, you know, the gentleman indicated it's on schedule. So there's a big, you know, construction schedule with targeted lines and bar graphs about dates and what happens when. So looks like they're on track.
They're finally getting good weather.
Yeah, so if you haven't been out there, the roof trusses are up. They'll probably get sheeted at some point. There was one little glitch that happened with regard to the plans and specs on the dirt area between the stage and the first
The
wall.
grading?
Grading needs to come down 18
Yeah,
inches.
they'll excavate a bit, but
Yeah.
that's okay. We're gonna be, it's sloped anyway.
We'll
It'll end
use
up
it.
being fine.
Yeah, we'll use all the dirt, but that's just a little bit of a glitch
It's a
there.
civil issue.
Yeah.
Do we have our first event planned?
Summerfest.
Oh, okay.
You have some bands out there for Summerfest.
Well, that's the international area, so it'll be actively, I mean, we'll have to see if we have occupancy and all of that and how it'll be completed. But the idea is to be able to appreciate it during Summerfest.
Will the electrical be fine by then?
Yeah, that's the plan. It's a good contractor. They're working really hard. They're
Oh, they
working
are.
fast, and they're doing a good job. So we're fortunate we have a good contractor.
I've walked by there sometimes from 4 to 6.
Yeah, there's
And
electrical.
the guy that's the head of that crew is still out there working.
Yeah.
I've seen him out there, so I agree with what you said. They are working hard.
Yeah.
It's like I say, I walk by there at 6:15 Tuesday, Thursday night workouts. There's somebody on site working.
Good concrete work. It looks good.
Yeah,
How are they
it
bringing
does.
in more electrical? Are they bringing
All right.
I beg your pardon?
Where are they bringing in the electrical?
We have power poles all down
Okay.
Engle Lane, and so we'll pull off of a
So
pole
there's
there.
plenty.
Oh, yeah.
Anything else? All right, thank you. We move to review of surface water management fees. Mr. Vigran.
Yeah. Take a break. It's gonna be a long one.
Good evening, Mayor and City Council. So as a follow-up to the May 7th public hearing on swim fees, we're here this evening to provide additional information on the rate credits. The information that we'll provide is specific to the policy and justification and the mechanics for changing the rate from the maximum 85% to 43%. We're providing you a comparison of the credits with other jurisdictions that we've had previously compared with. The number of properties and parcels that are taking advantage of the current program, and the options to grandfather existing systems at the 85% credit with the new systems adhering to the 43%. What we're asking for today and requesting of the City Council is to provide us direction with the credit program for the inclusion in the ordinance on May 21st. We have our engineering services manager, Greg Vigran, who's going to go into details about the credits, and then we also have our engineering services public works director, Paul Visage, here, who's also available. So with that, I'll turn it over to Greg.
All right, thank you. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, we've provided you some additional information based on the meeting last week and some of the public comments that were made. Wanted to note that
we started out with the 85% credit or the 10% to 85% credit range. We just basically copied the county's program initially when we incorporated. We weren't able to get a lot of history as to the relevance of those numbers from the county, but we will point out that they've recently reduced their maximum credit to 30% as well. They are grandfathering in the properties that already have a credit, and they're going to phase that out over 10 years. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, or if you have any questions on that. As far as the reasoning or the thought on going from 85% to 43%, FCS Group put together some information and really comparing what they considered the base costs of the program, the stormwater program, which are just the things that are needed regardless of private property, compared to the use costs. And the use costs are basically the extra burden from the additional properties. And there's some slides starting on page 96 that go into a little bit more detail, or the example that they previously provided. But ultimately, what they came up with was that 43% represents that use cost. And so that's really the value that's added by the properties that are keeping their stormwater on site. So that's why they would recommend no larger than a 43% credit.
So what goes into base costs? See
Well,
the term, but not a definition.
Yeah, so they had a quite extravagant spreadsheet that I didn't bring along, but it was primarily staff cost was a fair amount of it. Just other things that are going to be required regardless of, again, just adding on, the additional properties, whereas the use costs were primarily around the operational side of things in terms of the maintenance of the system, which obviously would be increased if you had a larger system because you have more systems connected, for example.
So base costs are attributable to all property in the city?
And PDS.
Correct, yeah, like our stormwater permit costs, our staff costs, just those things that would be needed regardless, or, that are just, I'm trying to remember the wording that they used.
Yeah, you wrote it in
yeah.
Engineering and PDS.
But what does that apply to? Commercial properties that have stormwater management systems, every property in the city.
The base costs?
The base costs.
So that's just the cost for us to basically manage the stormwater program. So, I mean, it applies just citywide.
The general government costs.
Correct.
It's allocated by square footage or what?
Yeah, and then how's that allocated? What's the percentage? How does the base cost turn into a percentage with respect to the properties that have these stormwater facilities?
Yeah, so they had it, and I apologize, I didn't bring the whole spreadsheet, but on page 97, they show at least the total, which they got the base at about $2.5 million. And they had the rationale as to how they got there. I just can't tell you more than that without looking at the spreadsheet.
Yeah, assume that number. How does that get applied against properties? Is it square footage, impervious surface, assessed value?
So let me kind of step in a little bit and talk a little bit more about this. So when you have your system costs, thanks, Tom. So for the stormwater utility, you have your engineering costs, your overhead, your benefits, you've got all those functions. And then you have the costs that are directly attributable to the operation and maintenance of your system. What they did was they took a look at it and said, everything that's not related to the operation and maintenance of the system is your base cost. That's our NPDS permit costs, that's our engineering, that's our staff, that's our phones, lights, rental space, everything else.
Fixed costs.
Fixed costs, exactly right. When you're talking about the operational side, the operational costs, they took a look at that and said, this is what we are paying in the operational costs. Now, to try to apportion how much of that is associated with city infrastructure versus private, what they did was they said, what's the total amount of impervious surface we have in the city? And what percentage of that is city-owned infrastructure, the roads, the parks, the parking lots around City Hall, all that is public infrastructure. That was about, if I remember correctly, about 19% of the total amount of impervious surface. So they said when you take the operational cost, and they use a couple different columns, and they say our cost, our percentage of the operational cost is 19%. Everybody else is going to be 81%. When you run all the rest of the costs, which are city costs, engineering, et cetera, the base costs, and then you do the proportionality of it, that's where they came up with and said, effectively, when you look at it, the end game, 43% of your cost is associated with taking care of your operational system, which is basically a percentage of the total impervious surface.
It's the denominator. My question is just what the denominator is. I understand all that.
Okay.
What does the 43% of what?
The total aggregate cost for the community. Do you have that?
No, I mean, what's it applied against? It's
must be the overall.
You've got is it impervious surface?
Impervious surface.
Okay,
Yes. It's a factor of the impervious surface. The simplest way to put it.
Okay.
No, I'm just thinking.
And I noticed that there are 4 city properties with $15,000 worth of credit on here.
That's correct.
Why do we take money out of one pocket and put it in a restricted pocket?
That's a good question. That's a good question. It's kind of weird that we charge ourselves, but I think it's still real property, so we take advantage of the credit program as well. So, but it does seem a little ironic, because it's like going in one door and out the other as far as the money.
So why do we charge ourselves stormwater?
I think because we're required to. And I think I verified that with FCS Group, because again, our property is real property, even though we're a government agency.
So we're not exempt because we're government, right?
Correct.
Religious organizations are exempt then?
Correct.
No, we've exempted the religious organization.
Right.
Right.
And that exemption is based upon what Pierce County has historically done.
And we don't charge for roads, right?
We do not charge ourselves for roads.
The county does. Extraordinarily expensive.
It's sort of hit and miss on which jurisdictions charge for roads and which ones don't.
The primary reason for charging yourself for roads, and every place that does always gives a significant reduction to the fee that they charge the roads, is because if you don't charge yourself for roads, you can't charge the Department of Transportation. And so that's the only way you can get cost recovery for DOT. And most jurisdictions who do not have a lot of contribution from the DOT right away, and they determine that it's not worth it trying to charge the general fund for transportation to feed the stormwater utility to get the amount of money they're getting out of the Department of Transportation.
Okay. We don't have to state that.
Mr. Ransom.
Okay. We've had the public hearing, that one of the things that some of the folks that brought comments who were commercial customers is that is not shown on the charts that you provided us, is they were saying they wanted to at least get some amortization to recover the costs of their initial investment in the system that qualified them for an exemption. And so if someone spent $600,000 on a system, they were looking for the exemption above the baseline 43% to be increased at least up until there was a recovery of that cost. However many years that took. I mean, if someone who had invested $600,000 in a system and the system was efficient enough to get them currently an 85%. What they want to do is keep getting the 85% until the difference between the 85 and the 43 equaled what they'd invested, and then it could roll back. And we get a lot of engineering document, we require a lot of engineering documentation from anybody applying for an exemption, that I would imagine identifying the cost of putting in that system, at least those systems that were put in while we were in the city, because we would have had permitted costs and dollar values there to be able to go and do that, to determine an amortization schedule that they could, let's say that we want to amortize it over 10 years. Then you look at, okay, your fees are going to be this for 43%, but that above that, how much greater of an exception should you get to amortize that $60,000 a year for 10 years before you went back to 43? Something along that line sounded like what folks were concerned, and that would maintain the incentive to put in a quality system in new development.
I can answer that question. I mean, the irony is anybody's going to have to put in the same type of system, regardless if they get a credit or not. So it's kind of a misnomer that we offer them a credit at all, because the systems aren't going to be different whether they get a credit or not. They still got to meet the water quality standards that are state law, that are passed down to us. It's just that they applied for a credit and they're getting a credit.
Well, you know, I understood.
So the systems
it seemed to be that folks were saying, I've built a system and I take care of 100% of my stormwater.
Right.
Okay, that no water comes off of my property into the city system.
Right.
And that I'm surprised to hear you say that every single piece of new construction from now on is not allowed to provide any stormwater going into the city system.
Well, if they were going into the city system, they'd have even more onerous requirements as far as, because they'd have to control the flow as well. And they'd still have that maintenance on site. So there's really, I heard what they said, but I don't agree with what they were saying as far as, I don't think they understand the fact that they would still have to meet our current standards if they put a drainage system in today. If they tied in to our system, then they'd have to also control flow along with having water quality features. And they'd still have maintenance. What's that?
Those are all state law standards.
Correct.
We're just enforcing.
And so then they would still have maintenance on their property because they'd still have a stormwater system to maintain. So in spite of what they said, I don't agree with what was said. I understand what the one gentleman was saying about the fact that 2 years ago, they had to hire an engineer basically to certify that their system was still being maintained. And that's what Mr. Purrier was referring to in terms of recovering that cost over like a 6-year period is what he mentioned. I know Mr. Arbini mentioned some other things, but that's where I don't agree with him because, again, the systems would have to meet current standard, whether they're tied into our system or they're keeping their water on site, and they'd still have to maintain their stormwater infrastructure on their own property, even if they were tied into our system. Our maintenance starts once it hits the street.
So the incentive question regarding new developers doesn't really.
There is no incentive.
There's no difference between an incentive and
correct
to be able to go and do that, other than
that's,
the yes/no incentive. I won't build anything, or I will build something.
That's one reason we're encouraging to reduce from such a high benefit.
But that's to the future you both are speaking to, correct? If I understand this discussion, what about the present? Because I heard you say there were parts of their arguments you agreed with, and I want to bring the conversation back to what you were agreeing with. You heard the gentleman from Lakewood Business Park talk about.
Right, so we do have a couple options that we want you to consider that would basically grandfather in reducing the credit over a period of time to at least that they'd have some time to adjust for that. So, and we'll talk about that here in a minute.
So let me go back just to make the point. The new warehouse in Woodbury.
Yes.
They have to do it to current NPDES stormwater. So the way they've designed that is they're supposed to design that huge, all that impervious surface where the water will
stay on site. Yep, and it's already constructed. And they put in vaults, to get the water quality treatment, and then it's just giant infiltration systems.
It is more effective to infiltrate your stormwater on site than it is to build a detention system and discharge it off site if you have highly permeable soils in the first case. Because the requirements to discharge a very small, minute amount, which would naturally come off the soil with highly infiltrative soils, results in your vault being so extremely large you can't afford to do it. So that would make no sense whatsoever. There isn't an engineer or developer out there who would want to do that kind of a practice if they can take a small piece of the property that'll take all the water and dump everything into it. Provide the water quality treatment and then infiltrate it on
So
site.
it's cost effective to infiltrate typically. It's actually cheaper than building, a detention
Because they
pond.
gotta get the grid.
They can park on it or whatever too.
Yeah, they can.
What break does a developed property get for, developed property get for, improving its system? What, rate reduction?
A break for improving? Oh, I mean if it's an existing system? Or I mean like
So somebody has a developed property, let's just look at King County Code here. If you have a developed property and you come and rework your stormwater system to create 100% infiltration, you get a 50% rate reduction. Do we have anything like that?
Then they would qualify for the credits.
Yeah, they could apply for a credit.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we offer, or that's what we have available, this credit program.
So if I'm understanding your question, if they have a pre-existing site and they're discharging it to our system, and if they come in and say, I don't want to discharge your system, I want to build something, keep it all on site.
Yeah.
Then they would go from not having the opportunity to be a part of the credit program to have the opportunity to be a part of the credit program. And so they would get, depending on where we landed on this, 85, 43, something, they would get that kind of a rate decrease on their stormwater fee. I think what they would find is that the cost of doing the engineering and the construction would never pencil out based on the rate credit that they would get. Assuming they got even an 85% credit, it would never pencil out because it's so expensive to do.
They're gonna do it anyway, right?
If they were to redevelop the site, then they would have to do it anyway. You're absolutely right. If they were doing it out of the goodness of their hearts and they didn't have to do it, that would be the only incentive, is to try to get to the credit program. And I'm hard pressed to see that they would save enough money to pay for it over the life of the site.
Probably get a better tax benefit by amortizing the capitalized cost, whatever it is.
Still gotta do that. They still do that.
Yeah.
All right.
They get a double whammy if they get a credit. They get to amortize their costs,
right,
and then they get a rate reduction on what's really a tax. So it's not one or the other.
Right.
It's both.
So moving on page.
I'm on page 89 of your, unless you're going there.
That's where I'm going next.
Okay, then I'll wait.
Okay. So we also included some comparisons of credits, just thought it'd be good to check that out. So we looked at some of the same jurisdictions that FCS group looked at, comparing rates. So as you can see, we grouped them into the top four, they don't have a credit program at all. And then the middle group goes from roughly 10% to 50%. And then our proposed change along with our single family rate is listed. And then DuPont's is a little bit higher, but it only applies to certain vacant land.
This is residential though, right?
Correct. And so, this is just, we put in our residential equivalent rate just to show, and then also put in everybody else's just to see where we stand. So you can see the range goes from basically 10 to 67%, and we're proposing 43, which is still on the higher side of what's offered, and some don't offer it at all.
What I didn't understand about the table, when I compared the two tables here, that most of the places that you up there indicated a range of credits, but proposed for Lakewood, it's not a range, it's a 43% credit. Well, in other words, currently we have a range of 10 to 85.
Actually, there are a few others in the ordinance. But we've mainly been talking about the 43 because it's the high end. So it actually does drop I'd have to look at the ordinance, but it's in the ordinance. We had also adjusted the ones that we have for, if somebody did build a detention or retention system, there's lesser amounts for those. I think it drops as low as maybe like 18%. So that's in the ordinance, not in this information.
So you're proposing that our current 85% credit go to 43?
Correct.
What are you proposing for our current 62% credit?
Yeah, well, that would go to 31, for example. It'd just be cut in half because it's roughly a 50% reduction. So what's shown in the ordinance, so we've got a few strange ones that in terms of the percentages, and the reason that is a number of parcels, their credit has been prorated, not to get too much into the weeds, but like Pierce College, for example, because only part of their system meets our current standards, you know, because as they've developed, they've built new systems. And so that portion of their property meets the 85%. So their whole parcel gets like a 21% credit because it's still only one parcel of land.
Isn't there a deduct for putting in a law of like?
Well, that was the sewers, that's different. Well, I guess they do, their storm does go down there, but, well, because they've actually disconnected a lot of their systems that they've constructed, so they're infiltrating more on site now, so that's one reason. And then all their systems that they've built, you know, meet current water quality standards. So they have a prorated credit, so does Technical College and Western State, as a couple examples.
So you would envision someone getting a 10% credit would only get a 5% credit?
Well, the 10% we're actually recommend go to zero over, we're recommending either goes away now or it goes to zero over a 5-year period, which we'll talk more about. Because most of the 10% ones are very small. The credit amount is very small.
2277.
Yeah, the total credit amount is like $2,200. So that's not much in the scheme of things compared to 300 parcels. Yeah, and 314,000 total. So we were proposing to eliminate the ones that are getting the 10% credit.
How much does it cost us to keep track of that?
Yeah, that's why we're eliminating the 10% credit, because most of them get like a $7 credit or something. I mean, you know, it takes more time than that to think about it, so.
Just to ask a sort of an off-the-wall question here.
Sure.
Which you, it's never stopped me before, sir, and this is the first time you and I have talked in this environment. And you'll hear me say things to my colleagues like, shut up. You said that the 85 credit rate would drop to 43%. You said you call that a reduction. Is it also fair to say that if you turn that around, that's a tax increase to the property owner?
I would, if you don't mind, I'd like to.
Go ahead. I mean, this is just spitballing here, but
okay.
I heard that used in that public hearing, and I want to nail this down before I start thinking about which option we want to follow.
I'm not sure how much of my background you're aware of, but I've spent 32 years in water resources. I've run stormwater utilities. I've been involved in water, sewer, and water, wastewater, and stormwater utilities. The first point I would make is being really clear that this is not a tax. This is a fee for service. It's an important consideration because taxes are viewed differently. Fees for services by the courts are viewed entirely differently, including about rate equity, making sure that people in the same rate category are treated exactly the same.
All right.
So your question, if I may just kind of rephrase that for you, is for those individuals who are currently seeing a credit of 85%, now they're going to see an increase in their stormwater fee.
Right.
And the answer is yes. But when you do an assessment of the benefits to the entire rate structure and all the people, they have essentially been receiving too high of a credit for the value and benefit that we receive from them having stormwater on their site. So they have been getting a higher credit that has been absorbed by all the rest of the utility ratepayers in order to accomplish the same level of work.
Now let's follow up on that. Because the second half of the stuff I heard here the other night was, this is a good way to disincentive businesses from coming into Lakewood. How do we confront that question?
It's very simple. It's a good question, but it's a very simple answer, which is, everybody has to follow the same standards and rules. We're all operating under our NPDES permits. We're all operating under the same engineering standards and requirements. It doesn't matter. In fact, to some degree, it kind of does matter if you're a phase 1 jurisdiction like Seattle or Tacoma, real close to home, or if you're Department of Transportation, because what they have to do is a little bit more than what we have to do as a phase 2.
Right.
So essentially, our stormwater rates can be lower than a phase 1 jurisdiction because we're not having to cover the same activities that they have to under their permit. Okay. Across the board, though, is it cheaper to do work here in Lakewood versus in University Place versus in Faircrest versus in any other small jurisdiction like Puyallup or Sumner? The answer is on the stormwater, no.
Okay.
It's not. It's not any more expensive. It's not any cheaper. We have better soils, so their stormwater controls on site should cost them less than if they're working up in my former jurisdiction, Bellevue, where it's really tight soils and they have to build really large detention ponds, which are very expensive and take up half of their parking lot. Okay, vaults are very expensive. Infiltration is very, very cost effective. So Lakewood has that advantage of being able to have people take a very small part of their property and put infiltration in, or even with the right engineering, put it underneath their parking lots so that they can still get the dual function of their land by parking on it. You can't put a building on it, but you can park on it. Does that help?
Can I ask?
Go ahead.
Okay. Are you done? I'm sorry.
I'm thinking some more. I mean, first of all, I appreciate the answer because I think I understood just about every word you said, so I appreciate the clarity.
I'll be happy to clarify.
But I want to sit here, I just want to think about what you said because there's still something niggling, but I want to, at the back of my mind, but Paul, you go ahead and ask yours.
Would we allow, get back to Woodbrook, let's say there were two facilities going in at the same time, would we allow them to co-build a detention facility?
Could they jointly build a facility?
Are you referring to like where the school is, for example, or something else?
Well, we could. No, actually, let's say
like a regional system.
Guys who are building the huge one. Now, the guys next door said, "We're ready to go too. We've got a road network. We're going to do this. We're going to share an entrance or do something, and we want to share detention."
I can't speak to Lakewood,
that's out of,
but I will tell you that it happens that way in many different jurisdictions without too much trouble, as long as you have the legal agreements in place that we know who to go after if they're not maintaining the system properly.
I would just say, the more complicated you make a rate structure, the more open it is to legal challenges, like, which he didn't say legal challenges, but when you start having, the Pierce County, for instance, had 7, I think, it might have been more, different surface water areas. They had 7 different rates. Okay. So they went from $30 or $40 in one part of the county to $100 and something over in Parkland, and it became more and more difficult to do that. And the numbers showed the Parkland people were literally paying for everybody.
That was a council decision. I worked for Pierce County at that time.
You did?
In water programs.
And the council changed their...
They wanted to have specific to their those
basins is what they call them. It's depending on the type of projects they have in that basin is why they charge different.
When it finally collapsed, they actually had to account for each area.
It was a nightmare.
And when it finally collapsed, the Parkland, the Surface Water Management Fund had a big fund balance, and the one that had Parkland, Spanaway, and Clover Creek, I think it was, had the entire fund balance. So because the other guys were only paying $30 a year, and if they did one major project and it was $100,000, they wiped the fund out and they had to borrow.
So, what's the backing up? What's the methodology for the division or differential in rates between single-family residences and commercial properties?
Yeah, so our single-family residence is just based on there's a equivalent residential unit that, and again, I think we used what the county had. I believe it's X number of square foot of impervious surface, and it's just a flat rate. So for single-family, it's all the same regardless of the size of the house or the property. For commercial, it's based on the amount of impervious surface, both building, pavement, and then gravel is like 75%.
Did we base that off a cumulative total of single-family residence impervious surface, or is it just something that was inherited? How do we know that allocation is fair between commercial and
yeah, there is a standard, and because I know FCS Group looked at ours and said, yeah, it's still relevant as far as the number. So I think it's just kind of, you know, common practice as far as what your average single-family property would have in terms of impervious surface, and that's the number that we use. And I can't tell you what it is off the cuff.
That number does vary a little bit by jurisdiction, because if you have a jurisdiction that has a lot of really small lots, so their single-family residential equivalent can be 2,200 square feet. Another location may be 2,500, another one may be 2,700. But they're all within a fairly narrow range. And then what you do is you say, this is what our single-family residential equivalent base is. Then you apply that to the commercial properties and figure out how many single-family residential equivalent units there are. And then you charge accordingly. Some places take the single-family and they actually have different categories of single-family. That's what Bellevue had, and they're looking to simplify that because it made the actual billing process and the checks and balances and verification very complicated. It took a lot of staff time, took a lot of money. Most jurisdictions, I think, for the most part, just say single family is a single family. We're going to assume that the average is X number of square feet of impervious surface. You're going to have some that are going to fall below that, some that are going to be above that, but it's not worth the time to try to break it down into different categories. And then you take that unit and you multiply it times how many of those units are already commercial, and that's where you develop their costs, typically. Does that answer your question? Yeah, thanks. By the way, if I'm going on too much, giving too much detail, please let me know.
I got another question. Oh crap, he's back. All right, now I understood, when we started this discussion, I was thinking this sounded a lot like an indirect tax. You have persuaded me by your argument that it is not, that it's a fee applied even-handedly across the world of surface water management. So then, what's the difference besides the number of words between options 2 and 3?
You want to tackle that one?
Are you talking about on page?
Because I'm talking page 90, which I suspect is what you gentlemen are going to want before you leave this table tonight, is what is our direction to you?
Are you talking option 2 and 3 or 1 and 3?
No, sir, 2 and 3. 1 is, as far as I'm concerned, is off the table.
There's not a lot of difference between, if I may, real quick, 1 and 3, the difference between 1 and 3 is 3 says after 5 years it drops. It's a cliff, goes straight to 43.
Right.
Okay, the other one goes on forever.
Right.
Option 2 is where we said, based on what we heard, there should be a time where it's a gradual decrease from the 85% down to the 43%. And we picked 5 years because we were hearing about 5, 6 years, someone saying, I need that amount of time to kind of do some cost recovery. And we looked over 5 years and said, 5 years seems like a reasonable number. 5 years, Pierce County's using 10 years, we could go 6 years. But it was to show you an order of magnitude. If we started off at 85% in 2019, or started right away in a reduction in 2019, but in 5 years, this is one way we propose to get down to the 43%. And if you do that, in each one of them, we tried to show you what the reduced revenue collection to the stormwater utility would be under each one of those options.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Sorry. No, that's good. So I know we're kind of jumping around, getting a lot of good questions. So just back onto page 89 at the bottom, just to reiterate that there's currently 119 properties that are getting a credit, and for the most part, most of them are pretty sizable because there's a little bit of work involved, obviously, to get the credit. So it's the Walmarts and the Western State Hospital, the Tech College, etc. Those are the ones that are getting the credit currently. And just as a reminder, we've got about 16,700 parcels in Lakewood, so it's a very small percentage that are actually getting the credit. So then on to page 90. Again, we had the 3 options to leave the program in place as it exists with the maximum of 85%. currently the savings to the property owners, 119 property owners, is about $314,000 per year. That would jump to about $472,000 with a rate increase, and so we're talking $2.3 million, over 5 years. That's the value there. The second option again would be to reduce the current rates over a period of 5 years, and the third option is to leave the rates as they are for 5 years and then reduce them in the 6th year down to the 43%. And the numbers there, we just try to at least put in words and numbers what that would look like in terms of the reduced revenue.
How does
the option 2 and 3, do we know the impact and what programs will lose if we choose those 2 programs?
Well, I would think the kind of the low-hanging fruit is capital projects, because that's the stuff that, those, that's what we kept adding and subtracting when we were looking at the different rates. So that would be, I guess, would be our recommendation.
It would affect our ability to build the swim capital, but also to participate wholly in the transportation capital projects for contributions.
So we might have to go out. Mr. Whalen, trying to get my head around our work on the swim fee increase vis-a-vis the credit decrease. So would it be fair to say if we looked at option 2 and we had a lesser reduced revenue as a result, would we have to raise the swim fee as high as we indicated we were inclined to do to get to the same point? Because we're raising the swim fee on people's bills to recapture, what, about $1 million in annual revenue? Do we get bond over a course of time?
Right, so you're talking about raising it to 60% to make up for the credit?
Well, you kind of wonder, if you can step down the credit like option 2 might provide, would we have to increase the swim fees as much as we're proposing to do it to get to the same level of revenue over time to do what we need to do to bond the projects?
The swim fee assumed that you would start off at a 43% credit. You would instantly, you do basically option 3, but right away. So when you go to option 2, what it means is that staying at the 50%, not changing that, it just means that the amount that we would collect over 5 years would be.
So this is already assuming 50%
yes.
increase. I got it. All right, already built it in.
That's already built in.
Yeah. It's unfortunate.
We would have a reduced collection over 5 years of option 2 in, can you remind me?
That's right.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Option 2 was.
Yeah, it's, sorry.
Sorry, I put these on.
Yeah, and I had to.
So over 5 years, it would basically mean with option 2, we would have approximately $600,000 less over 5 years. So that's, $110,000, $120,000 a year. Certainly something that, while I would like to have the money, I think we would in order to do the work. It's something that we could absorb, and we'll just reprioritize, and maybe on some transportation projects, we have to ask for a little bit more on grant funds.
Well, option 2 is best for us, isn't it?
Option 2 is best if we're going to do any kind of keep the 85% for a period of time and then ratchet it down. If you were to take the 85% and do it over 10 years instead of 5 years, that means that we would have an even greater reduction in the revenue stream coming in.
So in 19, originally 70-something%.
Well, what we could do is, starting in 19, keep it at 85, in 2020, drop to the next tier, and so on and so on. It depends on how you want to go about it. Do you want to use 2018 as your first year?
2019.
And is the
and
goal,
then 2019
to get
the
to
first
0,
drop down?
right? Yeah. Is that the goal?
Well, it goes to 43 for the ones that are at 85. The only ones that we're proposing go to 0 would be the ones at 10%.
Yeah.
And they would drop again incrementally over the 5-year period until they were at 0.
Do we have a spreadsheet or chart that shows us how that would impact the programs where the cutoff would change?
We don't have a spreadsheet for that.
What?
I guess in 2 years when we do the budget again, we can raise the rates. Probably would necessitate raising rates higher.
So again, it was delay, you could delay some work. But if you're considering this, then having a step down, option 2, especially if you started option 2 with your first reduction in 2019, that actually reduced the $590,000 shortfall, if you will, less revenue because we anticipated.
Oh, okay.
So even less than 590,000.
Well, actually, it was reduced the first year.
Oh, for sure.
Oh, you did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that does take into account.
So we just either have to borrow more.
And it'd be about 110,000 a year for that 5-year period.
Averaging.
Less.
Yeah.
Averaging it over that time
Average over
period.
5 years.
So it's not a huge sum of money.
You know, I still, maybe it's not being associated with government, but not being a career insider that causes me to have concern that we still can't admit that this is a tax. Because here's a distinguishing factor. And I'm in favor of the step down and changing it, but you take a public water system, a gas utility, electricity, sewer, telephone, and cable. Those are utilities. Ratepayers pay for those things. They're all created by man. Stormwater is a general government function. It's here before man, it comes out of the sky, and we choose to collectively manage it as a government. That's a general government function. And so when you're charging somebody for a general government function, it's fundamentally a tax, even if you call it a fee. But Washington State statute says it's a utility, it's a fiction.
We could have a long conversation about that.
It is a total fiction because it came out of the sky. It did not come in a pipe to my house.
Pierce County had a Supreme Court decision that it was a utility fee for service and not a tax, and I'm standing by that.
Well, that's a legal fiction created by the legislature. I mean,
so be it.
Okay, well, you know, certainly the one, you know, the dollars pieces are fine. That the advantage of, to me, the advantage of option 2 over option 3 is if we use option 3, then 5 years from now, we hear the same arguments we heard a week ago that I'm suddenly getting a huge change.
Right.
So so option 2, however many years you put into the equation, is a better thing to do that. And everybody in the city's rates are going to change in 2019, so it's better to use 2018 as the base year and make the first 20% adjustment in 2019. My one question was a new piece of new construction in 2019 that is the maximum credit for a piece of new construction. We're going to start off at 43.
Correct.
So that, you know, even if you've got an equivalent system to somebody who's today at 85 and you do that, you're starting at 43 because that's just your initial base rate, and it's going to stay the same, and we'll be doing that. So I'm certainly willing to take a look at option 2, the 100,000 and change a year. That as long as we continue to have a magician in the city manager's chair, we're fine.
And Todd watch his trips.
It's just, and I agree with what my colleagues have said about option 2. But I just want to again play a little more devil's advocate here about option 3. When I hear $110,000 reduction, now I realize that that's not a lot, and I realize the city manager and his staff do a very good job of managing the budget. It's still a reduction. And therefore, to play the devil's advocate, I would say, well, if we adopted option 3, which leaves rates as they are for 5 years and then down to 43%, does that give the city the opportunity to realign what it needs to do with its grant writing projects and its funding for the sources that SWIN money is used for? We've been thinking about the business sector. What about the city's budget? Because if there's one thing I've learned here in the last 4+ years, budgets are a moving target. You can't predict them, and they're going to turn out exactly as you think they are. Mightn't we be better served in leaving things as they are for 5 years, and then the drop-off that option 3 suggests?
Actually, I would say that from the utility perspective and for funding certainty, we would be better going straight to the 43% credit program and having confidence that we're going to recover that money, which we are not going to recover at 85%. And therefore, we can now use that money as a part of our capital program, whether it be match money or directly to projects, individual projects. As you can see from the analysis that Greg did, at least 4 jurisdictions have looked at the credit program and made the determination that it didn't make any sense, that they weren't getting any value out of the on-site work from the overall system. Others have determined that there's different levels of credit, not having gone through that with them. I do know that FCS Group, when they did the City of Lakewood's assessment, they're also the same ones that did Pierce County's. And Pierce County, because it's a much bigger system, different pervious surfaces, the exact same analysis, they ended up with closer to the 30% credit. And that's what Pierce County is adopting.
So this is what we've got here tonight, a fairly conservative approach to this whole idea. Because if we wanted to go all the way over, we could say 0%.
Exactly.
And be done with it and move forward.
And you would have the justification based on an analysis.
Exactly.
I think that we can support that.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So, are we okay?
Okay, so then applying the same step-down process to properties that we have essentially given a 100% credit to by exempting them, why would we not want to do that in the same way, where we have primarily churches, but some other organizations that are essentially getting 100% credit now?
Yeah.
Why not step that down in the same way? And instead of calling one a credit and one an exemption, they're both really credits.
Do you mind?
You want to?
Okay.
Sure, please.
Many of which don't have systems.
Right.
They just run on.
The idea of giving nonprofit groups an exemption is very rare. Greg did a little bit of searching with those same organizations, and he found no one other than Pierce County, and I think it was Edgewood, because they base theirs on Pierce County, actually gives an exemption, an outright exemption for nonprofits. I've had a conversation with our legal counsel, and in generalities, I think it's something we need to look at very carefully, because one of the things about being an enterprise utility is the obligation to treat all parcels within rate classifications the same. And if you have a parcel here, regardless of who owns it, and a parcel here, regardless of who owns it, and they look exactly the same, and one you're charging and one you're not, then there's a disparity on how you're applying your utility rates. I think that's something we need to look at very carefully. Pierce County has done it. Lakewood adopted Pierce County's code. This is an artifact of adopting an older code. The current look at it by FCS Group, from what I recall, said you really ought to consider not giving an exemption for religious organizations and others and nonprofits, because they are exactly the same as the parcel next door. And you could potentially run into some challenges on your code.
Well, I understand the suggestion that parcels look the same, that what is not the same is how they've historically been treated, which is something that has gone on for 20-some years. And I would suggest that I would like to get them to zero, okay, or to identical of things that are there. If they happen to be a nonprofit that has a system that would get them to an exemption rate, I'd like to get them to the exemption rate rather than being totally exempt. But nonprofits, like for-profit businesses, it's a challenge to make a significant change all at once into what has become a anticipated element of your budget. And so having some sort of a step down from the 100% to no exemption at all makes sense for the same reasons that business owners point out to us and that we're amenable to. So I kind of like to see something. So it doesn't necessarily have to be 5 years and 20%. It could be 3 years and 33 or something, but not just one big step down. And maybe it can be based on, I don't know whether you want to, again, not making it too crowded by tiering it and saying, well, big nonprofits need to get a step down, but small nonprofits don't, and it goes on off. I think just applying the same formula that we're applying to other folks that are having their level of exemption adjusted would seem to make sense to me rather than treating them differently.
I'd like to see a proposal for a step down, phase out of nonprofit, and see what the financial impact is at the same time. I look at it as a vestige. It predates the city. It reminds me of when I practiced law in Guam, where between 1898 and 1950, Guam was ruled by the United States Navy under regulations. They then passed the Organic Act. So they had no statutes. So there were more lawyers on Guam, probably half dozen at the time, from California than anywhere else. They adopted the entire California Civil Code. And then over the years that followed, and I was there 30 years later, they weeded them out as they went along. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Why do we do that? Oh, that was about something about farm country and doesn't apply here. So they kept, it was just a massive vestige statutes. And so I can see a council here, we need a fee schedule. We're starting up we're operating under Pierce County. We'll just take all of Pierce County stuff that to start out with, and we'll fix it as we go. So
we can certainly come back with a modification that takes the exempt parcels and does exactly that, tiers it in. I would propose we do it over 5 years, just like we're proposing for the step down on the credit program. So the first year they would get an 80%, and then 60, 40, 30, or 20, and then down to 0. It makes things easy if everything's based on the same time frame, if that's what you'd like us to do. Can I ask a question? What year were you on Guam? What years?
79, 80, and 81.
I was there 65 to 71. I was a little young kid at that time. I wasn't practicing law.
You know, and the disparity here, funny, I have a picture on my wall of Mayor Doug Richardson when I was chair of the Goodwill Board and we cut the ribbon on the Goodwill store here. That's an leased facility, so they don't own their parking lot. So they're nonprofit, but the stormwater fee is passed through to them as part of their triple net lease in that location. Somebody else might own their building and there's a disparate treatment.
So are
They
we
don't get
ready?
an exemption.
What?
They don't get an exemption.
No, because the property is all owned
They're not the property owner.
They aren't the property owner. They're
Right.
they're a triple net lessee.
So are we ready to vote on this next week, or do you carry it over?
I think we can
to
move
for 2
forward on
weeks?
this and add the other one later, perhaps, if we want to.
I mean, if they adjust it to option 2, and add the pieces about the nonprofits. That's easy to change in the text for the copy that's on the agenda.
The fiscal impact on option 2 has been presented to you tonight. The impacts on the exemption, right now what Greg's shared with me is that with the 50% rate increase, it's about $145,000 on the exemption that we're giving up every year. So take 20% of that, and that's what we capture the first year. 40% of that we capture the second year, 60% and so on. So it's revenue coming in, so it's going to be a positive net benefit. And actually it may work out fairly well if we're doing the step down here and we're stepping this up here. It would help offset the cost. So we're going to lose 120 here, but we're going to pick up 20,000 there, or 28,000 there, so it helps.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, but we already counted that in too, though.
The exemptions were entirely.
And there's also a little bit of mitigation to the step to doing all that, because the rate is going up anyway. So even though your exemption, you've got an exemption with the it's still your exemption is your percentage is based on the rate for that year, which is going to go up each year with the escalation provision. I think we was going to be 2.5%.
Okay. Think we have consensus. Move forward.
So we'll plan to come back with the ordinance with those changes, and
I think it would be good
plan
to see that.
Okay. So do you want to plan to vote on it next week, or do you want more time to look at it?
I don't think we need more time to look at it. We've looked at it a couple times there.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Kind of expected a flow chart on that.
I did too.
See the items tentatively scheduled for next week. We move to comments, reports by the city manager. Oh boy.
Yes.
Good evening, Mayor, Council. Just a few updates for you. Just a friendly reminder, next Monday, 6:30, you'll have a special meeting to do a walkthrough, talk-through of the new audio-visual infrastructure that we have here in the council chambers. You may have, actually, I think you're all aware that former mayor, longtime councilmember Claudia Thomas suddenly passed away on Saturday night. We've been in contact with her family. We've already put together a news release, run it by her family, so they've okayed it. So we're going to put something out on behalf of the city. I know we got a quote from the mayor there representing the council. Tentatively, the family is looking at Saturday, June 2nd, for some type of a memorial event followed by a celebratory event. That was something that she wanted. So looking at perhaps the memorial event at Four Heroes Elementary School, and then the celebratory event following afterwards at the McGavick Center. However, that is still very, very tentative, but I would just ask that you, if you can, mark your calendars for that date. And certainly as more information becomes available, we'll let you know.
June 2nd. Okay.
Saturday. Yeah. This morning, our team, we met to review opportunities for Lakewood as it relates to what was formerly the Tiger program, which is now the BUILD program. And I think as I've briefed this body before, the good news is Congress appropriated $1.5 billion in support of this program, infrastructure program for transportation projects, which is 3 times the amount that had previously been appropriated going back about the last 6 or 7 years. However, the downside is that the administration, which writes the rules on how the dollars can be used and this, that, and the other thing, are somewhat convoluted. For example, we only have until July 19th to submit an application, and that is not enough time. That is not enough time for us to pull together what is needed. I've done a Tiger Grant application myself, and it took 8 months and took the dedicated staff resources of about, 7 or 8 people on a fairly regular basis, plus some outside consulting to do the high-end economic analysis that would need to be done. It's a very, very competitive program. This particular program has, I think, this year for this round, some hurdles that we're not going to be able to overcome. One is just the timeline. The other is the match. The good news is that if we wanted to apply for $5 million or $2 million or $10 million, as opposed to in the past it was a minimum application of $25 million, we can. That's right in our bailiwick. Also, local projects are encouraged to apply. We've had conversations with Senator Murray's office on that, and that was the intent of expanding the program. 30% of the program nationwide is allocated for rural programs, which is a higher allocation from a percentage standpoint than previous years. Also, only $150 billion, well, not only, but $150 million is the maximum amount that can go to one state. So if you look at Washington State, which has been very, very successful in getting Tiger grants, that gets eaten up very, very quickly. But if we're shooting for 5 or 7 or even 10 million, I think we're definitely at the table. The key is the match, 20%. And what the rules say is that agencies cannot use any revenue that was put in place prior to January 1st of 2015. That's basically just about everything that we have, with the exception of TBD money and maybe some grants that we have recently received or are going to receive in the future. Even if we wanted to bond it, we can't use bond revenue. You can use tax increment financing, but we're one of 2 states that doesn't have it. But maybe in the future when we have the military benefit zone. So again, some high hurdles. So long story short, we're going to do 2 things. One is we're going to continue to work on our delegation on what Congress needs to put in terms of what the rules should be, which is, hey, how about like any other federal grant or state grant, we play by the same rules, which is, for example, a local match, that's our decision, in terms of where that funding is going to come from. But in the meantime, what we're going to do is we're going to evaluate a number of projects that we think could compete. We're presuming that this program is going to get reinstated again next year. And so then this time next year, we'll be in a much better position to be able to submit an application. Some of the projects that we're looking at, and we're just throwing things up against the wall right now. Steilacoom Boulevard, or at least a good portion of Steilacoom Boulevard, Washington Boulevard, Veterans Drive, of which we have some connecting Washington monies to be able to do sidewalks, not just on one side, but on two sides. Also, some of the projects that are coming out of the downtown sub-area plan, though we might not be ready for those in the upcoming year, but as we look out 2, 3, or 4 years, certainly those could be some projects as well. So we do think we have some viable projects, and so we just want to take our time and go through that, and of course we'll bring that back to you and keep you posted on that. But the kicker is, when we're talking with the delegation, is for Congress to essentially write the rules on how the application process should go about and things along those lines. A couple of major projects going on. I think everybody's aware, Steilacoom Boulevard projects. We've got some detours set up. The paving is going to occur between 88th and Ardmore this week, and also we've got traffic signal improvements occurring at several other intersections along that corridor. So, we can expect some delays out there. Our communications manager and our public works department are doing a good job in keeping folks informed via social media. Also, the Gravelly Lake Drive non-motorized project kicked off today. They're out there doing some work, and as a matter of fact, tomorrow evening at 4:30 to 6:30, we're going to be having a neighborhood meeting for folks who want to come in and learn about the projects and the impacts like that. I do want to point out that all the work on that project is occurring within the public right-of-way. So as I think you're all aware, we didn't have to acquire any private property. So all the work will be occurring in the private right-of-way, in the public right-of-way, including removing some trees and things along those lines. Though our project manager did walk with the contractor last week, and so you might have seen some pink pink markings up there. So he had the plans, and so he pulled off a number as well. So he was able to save a number of trees as well. So some good news there. Want to save our trees.
You're going to hear squealing.
So, about keeping the trees or taking the trees down?
Oh, people don't realize the trees are coming down.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot over by Madera, right?
There's a whole row.
The whole row.
Are they still coming down? Because there was a comment that those
If it's got a mark, if you saw it today,
okay.
the last couple of days.
Sounds like somebody who's lived there for 20 years and has that row of trees shielding them 5 feet from their fence is going to lose the whole. His name's Hamilton.
Okay.
Also, some of the laurel bushes are going to get trimmed up.
Yeah.
You know, I've asked them not to, don't go too deep, because that'll open things up, and we want to try and preserve people's privacies as well, because that's why they're there. The good news is, you know, over time it does grow back in, but some of them are infringing on the right-of-way, and in order to put the sidewalks in and the street lights and such, we are going to have to trim back some of those areas.
I noticed we still have the local access only sign there.
Yeah, we're trying to manage expectations in terms of, sometimes the contractor gets out a little ahead of us on that, but we're trying to minimize, you know, traffic flow through there as well.
If you live in Lakewood, you can go there. If you live in UP.
Local access only.
So.
Good.
I think we'll just keep that. There's a way around.
Well, the people on Interlochen are concerned that that means everybody's going to be diverted down Interlochen, the length of Interlochen to the bridge to go across, because they're not supposed to use Bradley Lake Drive.
Can't handle it.
Hey, just go. There's easier ways to go around first world problems.
Might have to improve that road eventually.
Every time we do a road project, we gotta
just take the bridge down, make it a fishing pier.
So the say no to panhandling and contribute to the solution, save your change signs have gone up. So I think we've had almost 35,000 repostings on Facebook on that. That by far has been the #1 item, I think, ever since
glad
the
it
city got
surpassed the art.
social media.
Social media comments, it surpassed the art.
So I do want to commend Communications Manager Bryn Grimley, who has been literally working 24/7 and responding to people's comments, and both publicly and then also when people, you know, they what do they call a private message, or they message the city's Facebook account. So she's been.
If Matt Driscoll's on you, you're doing the right thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So, well, we actually, Mayor, with all due respect to the TNT, we knew we were doing the right thing when we came up with this idea.
I know, but it's validation.
You're my validation.
That was inverse validation.
The Lakewood Police Department, once again, is going to be holding some free boating classes for folks, and they're scheduled for Saturdays, May 19th, June 2nd, and June 23rd over at the police station. And we do suggest that people register, and you can register online through our Parks and Recreation systems. Chambers Creek Canyon, you know, we continue to work with Pierce County and University Place on this. One of the, over Labor Day weekend, over Memorial Day weekend, the city is going to be working with the Washington Trails Association to lead some volunteer folks down there and do some trailhead improvements and do some cleanup down there. And so it's going to be occurring from 8:30 to 3:30. 8:30 in the morning to 3:30 in the afternoon on Friday the 25th, and then Saturday and Sunday the 26th and the 27th. And we have some links on if you want to sign up and volunteer and go down there. I'll make sure that you folks get that. We are actually close to finalizing, transitioning to the state's business licensing system. And I do want to say that the Department of Revenue has been extremely complimentary of our city team, as well as our infrastructure, the electronic databases that we have, and they have commented that we have been one of the quote-unquote easiest cities to go through the process. And later this week, we're going to be sending out notifications to our current licensees, you know, regarding the partnership, and the next time that they license, they'll have to go through the state BLS. Of course, we're going to have it all on our website and everything. But basically, long story short, we expect to go live on the first part of June. We're looking at June 7th or so. So that's moving along. I learned, you probably asked if you didn't hear this, so the city of Seattle implemented not a $500 head tax per employee, but a $275 one.
You gotta do that.
So our economic development manager and I and some others, we were talking, so we're gonna think about doing some kind of an outreach to
Amazon?
Seattle businesses.
Could we, I'm serious about this.
We are too,
It's
yeah.
a little off. Could we offer a per employee incentive for the first year for a new business?
Tax deduction?
A tax rebate of some site will give you $100 per employee for the first year for a new business coming to Lakewood.
Where do we get the money for that though? Is there rebate from what? Well, we don't
Yeah, it would have to be a rebate from a tax that we're currently collecting, because otherwise it would be a gift to public funds.
Yeah.
But you know, you could give them a rebate on property tax or
their
property
Just
tax.
the fact, I don't think it takes so long to ramp up anything that's significant. It could even be for the remainder of 2018, but in contrast to Seattle, it would be a good PR move. That just shows how business friendly we are. We'll even give you a hit.
Put an ad in the Seattle Times, that would be funny. Just about the no BO tax.
You could rebate 2.5% of their utility tax for electricity. Because they're paying 5%.
You could say, get ahead with no.
But I think we need to make it, for publicity, we'd have to make it per head. New job, FTEs, in your business, working, we'll give you this.
We are the true headhunters.
This is headhunting, yes. Yeah. But I mean, it'd be such a contrast that you can get press on it. Yeah. Really statewide.
You know, it only takes.
We're trying to suck some of those people out of there.
By the way, it only takes 3 or 4 businesses, right? I mean, good-sized businesses to have an impact in Lakewood.
Exactly.
So if they have 20 employees each, should be great.
Yeah, that's right. So, we'll report back to you.
I'll help you design the ad. Don't wordsmith it for
And you can do it for businesses that have at least 20 employees.
What's the budget for artwork? And art.
You know, I just want to be clear, it's you folks who are dragging out my report here. I just want to, next Monday, and I'm sorry, not next Monday, at your next study session, which is the Tuesday after Memorial Day, May 27th, one of the agenda items is to give you an update on the 2019 comp plan amendment schedule. So long story short, what we're looking at is kicking it off on September 1st, 2018, so a few months. Allow people about 30 days to want to privately initiate a comp plan amendment. It would then process through the Planning Commission. It would come to the City Council in terms of what the privately initiated ones are, what the publicly initiated ones are, what the ones the Council or the Planning Commission want to initiate. And then we would go through the whole process, and it would probably take us through June, July, August of next year. So it's about a 12-month process. Certainly at the staff level, you can expect some suggestions and or recommendations in regards of things that, you know, maybe the council can undertake, including some potential comp plan amendments down in the Woodbrook area. The other is looking at prohibiting used car auto sales, as well as adopting new standards for used car auto sales in our NC2 zone, C1, and C2 zoning districts, which quite frankly, we don't believe is not appropriate for auto sales. And there's a place for them, and there's a place not for them. So, but it would go through a process, but I would just ask that you think about that.
Is that city initiated?
We would recommend that it would be city council initiated. That's correct. That's correct. So, and by the way, businesses within those zones, if that was to pass, they would be allowed to stay. God bless. It's just that they would be
phased out,
non-conforming. Yeah, they would phase out over time. That's correct. We're seeing them bubble up in areas that
pockets
we don't think is appropriate. We
Yeah.
don't think is appropriate for that type of activity as we look out into the future of Lakewood.
I agree.
So, and then as far as your calendar goes, this Wednesday evening, Greater Lakes is having their anniversary celebration, so 5:30 to appetizers and stuff, 5:30, and then they have a program about 7
Wednesday?
o'clock or so. It's Wednesday.
I didn't sign up for that yet. Is it too late to do that?
If you want to let us know, if you want to, we can RSVP on your
And I'll
behalf.
pay you a thing or whatever, yeah. If you would, for me.
Is that 5:30?
So what time does it start?
5:30.
Till when?
It usually goes, I think I usually get out of there about 8 or so.
Yeah, I've got the Pierce College board meeting at 5, so I'll get there as soon as I can.
Then on Thursday morning is the SSMCP elected official council meeting down at Eagles Pride Golf Course. That's from 7:30 to 9:30. And then on Saturday, a number of things happening on Saturday. In the morning, kicking off, working through the afternoon is the Ray Evans Memorial Fishing Event over at American Lake Park. Also, JBLM is going to be hosting Armed Forces Day. It'll be over on the McCord Field side. Entryway is in off of 112th and South Tacoma Way there. And then that evening, Clover Park Technical College is having their 75th year gala event over at the McGavick Conference Center. And that'll take us through the weekend.
75th, that's Saturday.
This Saturday? No, I'm in San Diego.
That also is that Joe Ethel requested that's to participate in the cancer bladder.
That was this weekend. Yeah, we put that on social media. Yeah, I think it was Sunday. Wasn't it Sunday? Saturday. Saturday. Correct.
I saw him as I was going through the park.
Yeah.
I will be attending that.
Any questions?
Are you going to Clover Park then?
Yes. Can borrow your tux?
Yeah, sure. You feel?
All right, council comments, Ms. Moss.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As I stated last week, I was attending the trustees conference. It was held at Clark's College. And it's interesting how I pay attention to what's happening in those cities in comparison to what happens here in Lakewood. And we have a lot to be thankful for. We don't fight with our neighbors like some of the other countries do, other cities do. And they're having a challenge with Oregon and Washington coming together to build their water frontage. It's been quite a challenge for them. So I just thought it just stood out to me because of what we go through and how we.
So that was at which college?
Clark College. It's right in.
They're in Vancouver.
Vancouver, Washington, yes. And tonight I attended a school board meeting. They had a full audience. And they were all talking about the incident with Abby. And they said that our schools have a real issue with bullying.
Really?
A lot of parents were there talking about that not just Hudloff is big, but Lakes and some of the other schools are having that same issue, and they don't feel like they're being heard. So that was a big, I talked about a little bit about our safety program with the housing inspection, and Mr. Schaefer wanted me to assure that the council knew he appreciates the fact that we are not going to make people homeless. So, just share.
Ms. Walking.
Well, I had a trip for my day job to the Government Finance Officers Association conference in St. Louis, Missouri. And it actually was very interesting, and to kind of dovetail with the remarks of Councilmember Moss, you realize that we have so much growth in this area and so much more going on than a lot of these other areas, and they're struggling, and they struggle with pensions and various things like that. I mean, there's a tremendous number of things I don't go to because the county's on the curves, and because they're talking about pension, those kind of benefits. So we are fortunate that we are in a growing area of the country, and we're able to get some issues done. And so
Resser.
Well, again, to piggyback on Councilmember Moss's remarks, I've been concerned about the situation with bullying in the community and the discourse that it has created that hasn't all been positive. Okay? I mean, I don't think that the school district has responded in a very transparent way. Their response has been defensive. I think that much of the discussion on social media, a very small percentage of it has been constructive, right, in terms of what can you do to be able to deal with it and going on. And so it's caused me to wonder in this environment as community leaders and engaging other community leaders, is there a way to acknowledge that it's a problem here in our community, but exercise some leadership in a positive way that would move us towards some solutions? And this is not an area that I'm a practitioner in, so I'm not quite sure what that would look like, but I certainly would be interested if Mr. Boki would ask the Youth Council if there are some positive, constructive suggestions that the city might go, and if the Promise Board might have some, they're supposed to be advising us to be able to go and do that. I don't know whether our community services, we could ask our community services funding board to look to see whether there is a counter-bullying program that we might fund or that they might specifically seek proposals for to be able to go and do that. But I think that this is a significant enough community concern that over the next month we should exercise some leadership and come up with a message and maybe some idea about a way that we want to be a catalyst for something constructive to happen. Again, I don't got ideas to propose or things to do that, other than I'm passing on that I sense a need, and I think if we can discuss it at a future meeting or can come up with something that's a role for us to play, we don't run the schools, but on the other hand, we contribute and deal with a lot of the summer programs and other programs that involve youth. And there may be something there for us. I'd like to take a role. I just don't know what that role can be that I could anticipate making a positive impact. I need to look for it.
You're here, I agree. Go to Mr. Simpson. Keep it balanced.
Yeah, between the two roses and the two thorns on your sides. I have to agree with what Mary, Mike, and Paul commented on. I heard about this a little differently. The mother of the young lady's best friend was very direct in what she had to say about what happened to her daughter's best friend. And Mike, I have an idea. It's out there, but I think I heard it discussed amongst us here. maybe the city, if you want to talk about taking leadership, maybe we should take leadership. Understand my drift? Because when that mother can tell me that she and the young lady's mother called this principal repeatedly and nothing was done, that points right at the board. And there's some other things I want to say here too. There's a reason my children don't go to school in Lakewood, Washington. And God damn it, it starts with that school board. And it starts with the fact that this kind of nonsense goes on in our schools. And there's a good reason why they will not go to high school in Lakewood, Washington. Because of this kind of nonsense that we, in a sense, allow. And so I do appreciate it. I apologize if I get a little angry about this, but they are the future. I meet that future every morning at 7 a.m. in my class. They are the future, and this is what is happening. So I'll be quiet on that point.
Both of those parents were there tonight, and they told that story.
Yeah, Mary, I heard it, I mean, as close as I am to Mike. I mean, she was very direct. What else was I going to say? Oh, on a brighter note. Several study sessions ago, I mentioned something about the 446AW, about how I'd been out on a flight with them and how we wanted to cement relationships a little better. They're on board. So I will be sending, I guess, Bryn an email about how to link her, connect her up with their public affairs officer. They're willing to write something on a quarterly basis if we can put it on the city's website. They want to get a little more of, since we have a community connections program that's heavily weighted to the JBLM and 62nd, the 446 would like to be a part of that too. So I did talk to those people and they are definitely willing, and I think that only helps the city and the reserve component that serves here. Otherwise, I think it was a very good study session tonight. I really enjoyed learning about the storm water management fees. And I agree with the mayor. He and I were the only two that said tax. And I still think it's a tax. It's an indirect tax, but be that as it may. I thought it was a very good, productive meeting, which speaks highly of this group.
Mr. Whalen. Well, your comments dovetail on mine on this whole bullying issue. Is, to me, having practiced law, as Don has, for 25 years for me and longer for him, really is about a case for civility. We have got to raise the level of discourse in this country, and it's going to take a sea change. And it's going to start not only with adults that'll be exhibiting and modeling behavior for kids, but hopefully the kids will learn from that. And it goes back to the issue. You know, I got a kid at Hudloff.
Yeah, I know you.
And I got a letter, an email, or whatever from administration that day. It was so cryptic. I had to write back. I didn't know what had gone on. I had to write back and say, what is this about? If you want me to, you know, console my child, what is going on? No response. You know, and so that, I guess, was fine. But, you know, be that as it may, I think there's lots we can talk about in terms of how we can stand up and be leaders in this kind of situation. But it takes, I think, some leadership by adults and not just the kids. Because you look at the social media crap that's out there, and whether it's this issue, or whether it's the panhandling signage, or whether it's the art on Washington Gravely Lake, you know, there are examples that we can set for our children by being civil adults in discourse and teaching others how to have civil discourse. And I am one who doesn't put up with a lot of BS, and so when someone says something stupid on Facebook and calling us greedy politicians for having the audacity to try to do something about the panhandling issue, I call them on it. And I tell them, your comments are out of line. And it's civil, but we have got to put people in their place. And that's the behavior, I think, that we can help exhibit if we're going to do anything. I would love to see us eventually do some sort of symposium where we involve the youth council and us, and we make an invite to the school board if they're so inclined to participate. If they do, great. If they don't, great, it's fine. But I agree with you, we can exhibit some leadership, at least get a conversation going. And if nothing else, teach these kids that you can have a civil discourse about issues of significance that impact their lives without calling names or casting aspersions or pointing fingers. I think we can have a healthy conversation. If we start that, then you start to change the tone. And it's only when you can change the tone that people have respect for one another in the classroom. You know, there's probably more to follow on the poor unfortunate Gabby situation, but I can tell you, you know, my 6th grader doesn't feel like she's had that issue at Hutloff. She's had a very good experience there. She didn't really hear much about what had gone on, and until I tried to probe her about it. Hey, did you hear, you know, about this or whatever? So, anyway, more to follow on that. But the bullying, I tell you, I see more adults bullying each other on that stupid Facebook, social media crap than the kids do. So I think there's some change to be had.
So I can tell you that we knew more than the school board did.
I'm sure.
The administration.
Yeah, I'm sure. It's just unfortunate.
And even after inquiry.
I was in just several briefly my Washington trip. I had a chance to enjoy a couple of days in D.C. With 50 of my closest friends from government and business throughout Tacoma-Pierce County. And it was actually quite a good conference, and we had, the format was different where we went to the Senate building, the Dirksen building, and we had panel discussions on cybersecurity and JBLM, all sorts of other topics. But the high-level 30,000-foot stuff from the AUSA briefing and the other guys from the JBLM briefing is that there will be no BRAC. There is no budget that contains a BRAC. There is no focus on having a BRAC. It is not on the radar, at least for now. You know, it changes with the budget cycles, but it's not on the radar for now, which is a positive thing potentially for us, even though we were supportive of a BRAC if one were to happen. But apparently it's not in the offing. Cybersecurity, the panel there was pretty interesting. They talked a lot about there's going to be a 4-star command for cybersecurity. It's going to be stood up. JBLM will have a role to play in some of that, as well as other bases around the country. From an economic development standpoint, that potentially gives us some opportunity. Infoblox, which is a company in downtown Tacoma, it's out of Silicon Valley. They started an outpost here in Tacoma. Now they're over 100 employees strong. And there's a good opportunity for growing cybersecurity and infrastructure networking in the South Sound. So it's something that we can think about taking advantage of from a business recruitment and retention opportunity. I spoke a lot with Denny Heck when he was there. We talked, he said to say hello to all of you. He was very bullish on all the things that the city of Lakewood is doing, and had a chance to chat with past your well wishes on to Jay Kim and Paul Kramer, who was at the panel discussion, both of which were chatting a little bit about the whole base thing and, you know, what we're doing to help with the clear zone, and educated a lot of people in the room, and so that was a helpful deal. So, good conference, more comments, but not at 10:30.
Thank you. Yeah, the bullying issue is difficult. I think we need to carefully plot a course to being a leadership group. The context is different than the past. I came from a tough town where there was a lot of bullying, bloody noses, physical bullying. Junior high kids are mean, especially girls. I had 4 girls experience that full time. Guys punch each other, and so
call every day.
And schools are expected to be parents a lot more than they used to be, because the parents exhibit some of that bad behavior that you've seen on social media, which is the new way that bullying follows kids home. Unfortunately, it seems to be that the schools in general, not just Clover Park, but schools in general, have allowed discipline to decline, taking a hands-off, even-handed meaning we don't do anything to anybody. We don't want to upset anybody by singling them out for discipline or an adverse consequence. And what would it be to someone who tries tries to defend themselves. And I'm not because of the physical aspect of this, but I'm reminded of a kid who was one of my playmates beginning grade school named Billy Stamper. They came from one of the very few affluent families, so he had a really neat basketball court at his house. He also had special needs. He was somewhere on the spectrum. We didn't know that. We just know that Billy wasn't right. But Billy was nice, and one of my best friends kind of adopted Billy, and we played basketball with him. We included him. He went away to a state home for a number of years, and we were very disturbed when he left. The thing about Billy was he couldn't be picked on because we were his posse. And if somebody picked on Billy, they would have had to pay. They would have got a short warning to back off, leave Billy alone. If they did anything else, we would beat the crap out of them. Now, not so socially acceptable as that might have been in a Milltown in the 1960s. But I think we can, as leaders, one aspect of it is teaching the students to stand up and protect people who can't protect themselves. So, and to make judgment decisions to call people out and to trust adults to back them up when they do. So, I think we can find a role, and we need to.
Do we want to open a boxing club?
Yeah. My dad had some boxing gloves that he had when he was a youth, and he got down on his knees and taught me how to protect myself.
That's how my father did it with me too. He put up his fists, and one Saturday afternoon, and I learned the hard way. Nobody ever picked on me again.
There were comments made that.
The problem is nowadays they can't.
Yeah.
There was comments made that.
Yeah, and that's
teachers are bullied.
to me ridiculous. If somebody hits me on the street, I can cold cock them. There's no repercussion.
Because
You should be able to in the school.
I was just saying there was comments made tonight that teachers are also bullying some kids.
Really? Well, that could be trying to discipline.
I want us. We need to be very careful in taking one side of the argument. And it's possible that there is an issue there at Hudlock, and that maybe there's an issue that the school district has a personnel issue that they need to deal with at that specific site. But we need to we don't want them to meddle. We don't want to meddle in their affairs if we're not willing to have people meddle in ours, right? I mean, be careful, people in glass houses throwing stones. That's all I'll say, because we've got our flaws too. And we could have people say, you know what, you guys don't seem to be able to run your situation. Maybe I should do it, or maybe we should do it.
I like to think about a symposium with the kids from the youth council, not to cast any aspersions, but just to kind of get the perspective.
I don't know if there's
I think that while I hear what you're saying is that I'm not looking for our role to be meddling in their business, to be able to go and do that. But I'm trying to have a forward-looking view, and I'm not going to cede to the school board that they are the agency that's responsible for young people in this community. I think there is a shared, and it isn't them and us, I think we need to build a pretty large consensus of folks that are concerned about developing young people in the right way. We talk about the promises and being able to go and do that, and sometimes the promises have, provide opportunities for leadership and have a caring adult and being able to do that. I think there's a missing component there about being a citizen at all the different levels that you are involved, you know, in your family, in your classroom, in your neighborhood, in your city, wherever you're going. I hope we can come around on a way that we can be positive but not meddling, okay? Being focused on making change in the community. You know, because it's not our role to try to deal with the situation that happened. That's, you know, we don't have a role in that.
I will just
particularly.
I will just say that it was public comment and there was cameras.
Say again? Yeah.
That was public comment and there was cameras in the room.
Yeah, and I imagine there was a lot of finger pointing, okay, and things to do that, and you know, and we got to get the discourse beyond that as to saying, you know, here's how things get better that are going on in terms of the nature.
So, we need an executive session. 15 minutes to discuss litigation, potential litigation. So we will, pardon? Litigation and potential litigation. Yeah. So we will recess for 15 minutes to discuss legal or litigation and potential litigation with counsel for the city. We will return and take no further action to adjourn. We are in recess. Yeah, what's the last scene of She's Done a Few Good Men?
I know exactly.
Oh, yeah, totally. Hey, look at your Facebook post of her sister. Oh, my God. Her sister, she was so lovely in this one. Her sister is with folks. This poor child has all sorts of issues. Yeah. Right. Just so. It's a